Welcome to True Crime Headquarters. Tonight, we explore for unsettling stories where appearances concealed something far darker. Now take a moment to settle in. Breathe slowly. Let the outside world fade. This is the story of the vanishing billionaire, the Teddy Wong mystery. Now let's begin. The harbor lights below glittered like fallen stars, but Teddy Wong never looked at them anymore. At precisely 8:30 on that warm April evening, the 56-year-old billionaire property magnate slid behind the wheel of his Mercedes-Benz, alone. The leather seat creaked beneath his slight frame as he adjusted the rearview mirror, a habit unchanged in 7 years, despite what had happened before. Behind him, the Hong Kong Jockey Club's bright windows cast long shadows across the parking lot. Ahead, the steep climb of Magazine Gap Road wound toward his mansion on the Peak, Hong Kong's most exclusive address, where guard dogs and a pet monkey waited behind high walls. He was a creature of habit, almost pathologically so. Every Tuesday evening, same route, same time, same solitary drive. His wife Nina had begged him to vary his schedule. The police had warned him. Even his business rivals whispered about his dangerous predictability. But Teddy Wong was a man who believed that lightning never struck the same place twice. He had survived one kidnapping in 1983, 8 days chained to a bed in darkness, released only after Nina paid $33 million. The memory should have made him cautious. Instead, it made him complacent. If you enjoy listening and would like to find this channel again, you're welcome to subscribe. The first 48 hours in any kidnapping case are critical. Investigators know this with bone-deep certainty. It's the window when memories are fresh, when witnesses haven't yet convinced themselves they saw nothing, when evidence hasn't been scattered by wind and rain and the simple passage of time. It's when the victim's trail is still warm, when phone records can be traced, when desperate kidnappers make their first crucial mistakes. After 48 hours, the odds drop like stones thrown into a harbor. After 48 hours, cases go cold. But first, someone has to notice the victim is missing. The Mercedes purred up Magazine Gap Road, its headlights cutting through the humid darkness. The narrow street snaked between towering apartment complexes and colonial mansions, their windows blazing with the warm glow of wealth. At this hour, the road was usually empty, just another reason Wong preferred this route. No traffic, no witnesses, no complications. They were waiting at the blind curve near Severn Road. 2 vehicles blocked the road ahead, their positions calculated with military precision. Behind, a third sealed-off escape. The trap was elegant, professional, and utterly inescapable. Wong's foot hit the brake too late. The Mercedes jerked to a stop, trapped in a box of steel and shadow. Doors flew open. Men materialized from the darkness, their faces obscured by the glare of flashlights. The entire operation took less than 90 seconds. Wong's hands were bound with professional efficiency, tight enough to control, loose enough to avoid injury that might lower his value. A cloth bag descended over his head, plunging him into suffocating darkness. Hands grabbed his shoulders, his arms, lifting him bodily from the driver's seat. The smell of diesel fuel and sweat invaded his nostrils. Someone was speaking rapid Mandarin, voices overlapping, urgent but controlled. These weren't amateurs operating on impulse. These were professionals executing a plan. The Mercedes engine was still running when they threw Wong into a waiting truck. The door slammed shut, metal against metal, final as a coffin lid. Tires squealed on asphalt. Within 3 minutes of the ambush, the convoy was gone, swallowed by Hong Kong's labyrinthine street network. The abandoned Mercedes sat in the middle of Magazine Gap Road, driver's door hanging open, headlights still burning into the empty night. In the back of the truck, Teddy Wong felt the vehicle turn sharply, then again the motion disorienting in his forced blindness. The floor beneath him was cold metal, ridged with industrial treads. He could hear at least 3 men around him, their breathing, the rustle of clothing, the occasional murmured instruction. One of them was smoking, the acrid smell of cheap cigarettes mixed with the hood's musty odor. The truck's suspension bounced over speed bumps, then smooth highway, then rough road again. They were moving fast, changing directions constantly, making their trail impossible to follow. The clock was already ticking. Back on Magazine Gap Road, a passing taxi driver noticed the abandoned Mercedes at 8:47 p.m., 17 minutes after the abduction. He slowed, considered stopping, then accelerated away. Hong Kong in 1990 was a city where the wealthy kept secrets, and smart people didn't get involved in other people's business. It would be another 20 minutes before someone called the police, another 15 before officers arrived on scene, another hour before anyone confirmed the vehicle belonged to Teddy Wong. By then, the first precious hours were already bleeding away. At 9:15 p.m., Nina Wong stood in the marble foyer of their Peak mansion, staring at the grandfather clock. Teddy was never late. Never. His punctuality was legendary, obsessive, really. She had already tried his car phone twice, listening to it ring unanswered into the void. A cold dread was beginning to settle in her stomach, heavy and familiar. She had felt this before 7 years ago, when the phone call came demanding ransom. When she'd learned her husband was chained in darkness, alone with strangers who saw him only as money. She picked up the phone to call the police. But something stopped her hand. What if she was overreacting? What if there was an innocent explanation? Car trouble, an impromptu business meeting, a simple delay. What if calling the police would embarrass him, make him angry? Nina Wong had spent her entire marriage trying to read her husband's moods, trying to anticipate his reactions. Even now, with fear clawing at her chest, she hesitated. She waited another 30 minutes. At 10:02 p.m., 92 minutes after the abduction, Nina finally called the Royal Hong Kong Police Force. Her voice was steady when she reported her husband missing, controlled and precise, the voice of a woman who had learned to hide her terror behind a mask of composure. The dispatcher took her information, promised to send officers, and assured her that there was probably a simple explanation. People went missing all the time in Hong Kong. They usually turned up. But Steve Vickers, the head of the Criminal Intelligence Bureau, knew better the moment he heard Teddy Wong's name. Vickers was a legend in Hong Kong law enforcement, a British expatriate who had dedicated his career to fighting organized crime, kidnapping rings, and the powerful triads that operated in the territory's shadows. He had handled 28 kidnapping cases in his career. He had brought 26 victims home alive. The 2 failures haunted him still. When his phone rang at 10:47 p.m. with news of Wong's disappearance, Vickers felt his stomach drop. He remembered the 1983 case, remembered Nina's panicked decision to pay the full ransom immediately, against his advice, remembered how lucky they'd been that the kidnappers were professionals who kept their word, remembered warning Wong afterward to vary his routine, hire bodyguards, take basic precautions. The man had ignored every recommendation. Now Wong was gone again, and the clock was already 2 hours into the critical 48-hour window. Vickers mobilized his team within minutes. Officers raced to Magazine Gap Road to secure the scene, to photograph the abandoned Mercedes, to search for witnesses. Others began pulling phone records, reviewing security camera footage from the Jockey Club, compiling lists of Wong's known associates and business rivals. The investigation machinery ground into motion, but Vickers knew they were already behind. 2 hours was an eternity in a kidnapping case. The trail was cooling with every passing minute. The Mercedes yielded its secrets reluctantly. No blood, no signs of struggle, no convenient fingerprints left behind. The kidnappers had worn gloves, moved with practiced efficiency. The only evidence was the pattern itself, the professional execution, the surgical precision of the blocking maneuver. This wasn't opportunistic. This was planned, rehearsed, funded by people with resources. But planned by whom? And more importantly, was this truly a kidnapping or something darker? The question gnawed at Vickers as midnight approached, as the first 4 hours slipped away into history. By dawn on April 11th, Teddy Wong had been missing for 10 hours, and Nina Wong had not slept. She sat in her husband's study, surrounded by the trappings of his success. Mahogany bookcases lined with leather-bound ledgers, framed photographs of construction projects, awards from business associations. The room smelled of his cologne, faint but persistent. On the desk, his appointment book lay open to Tuesday, April 10th. The final entry, written in his precise hand, Jockey Club, 6:30 p.m. The phone on that desk had not rung. No ransom demand, no proof of life, no contact whatsoever. In the 1983 kidnapping, the call had come within 6 hours. The silence was wrong, ominous in its completeness. Steve Vickers arrived at the Wong mansion at 5:47 a.m., his face haggard from a sleepless night. He found Nina in the study, still wearing yesterday's clothes, her eyes red but dry. She had cried herself empty hours ago. Now there was only waiting and fear, and the terrible understanding between them, the knowledge that every hour without contact meant the odds were dropping. Vickers had been dreading this conversation. In his experience, wealthy families often became liabilities in kidnapping investigations, emotional, unpredictable, prone to making catastrophic decisions. Nina Wong had already proven herself capable of exactly that kind of impulsive action in 1983. He needed her cooperation, but more than that, he needed her patience. He needed her to trust the process, even when every instinct screamed at her to do something, anything, to bring her husband home. He explained the protocol carefully, speaking in the measured tones of a man who had delivered this speech too many times. When the kidnappers called, and they would call, he assured her she must not agree to their first demand. She must ask for proof that Teddy was alive. She must negotiate by time, give the police a chance to trace the call and track the money. Most importantly, she must not pay the ransom immediately. Professional kidnappers expected negotiation. Amateur kidnappers were unpredictable and dangerous, but they also made mistakes. Either way, patience was essential. Nina listened in silence, her face a mask. Vickers couldn't tell if she was absorbing his words or simply enduring them. He had a sinking feeling that history was about to repeat itself. Across Hong Kong, the police investigation was expanding rapidly. Officers were canvassing Magazine Gap Road, knocking on doors at dawn, interviewing residents who might have heard or seen something the previous night. A taxi driver came forward to report the abandoned Mercedes. He was questioned for hours, his timeline carefully documented. Security guards from nearby buildings were interviewed, their logs examined for any suspicious vehicles or individuals. Every CCTV camera within a mile radius was being reviewed, though Hong Kong's surveillance network in 1990 was far less comprehensive than it would later become. The forensics team had spent the night processing the Mercedes. They found nothing useful, no fingerprints, no hair or fiber evidence, no convenient clue left behind. The kidnappers had been meticulous. Even the positioning of the blocking vehicles showed professional knowledge. They had chosen a spot with no security cameras, minimal traffic, and multiple escape routes. This was the work of people who knew Hong Kong's geography intimately and had conducted reconnaissance. At 8:15 a.m., 16 hours after the abduction, the first break came, not from forensics or witnesses, but from informants. Vickers received a call from one of his confidential sources in the criminal underworld, a man who traded information for protection and occasional blind eyes. The source reported whispers about a major operation involving Taiwanese gangsters, multiple cells operating independently, and a target with significant wealth. The description matched Wong perfectly. Taiwan. The word sent a chill through Vickers. Taiwanese organized crime groups were sophisticated, well-funded, and brutally efficient. They had the resources to plan an operation like this, the international connections to move money quickly, and the discipline to maintain silence. Worse, they operated outside Hong Kong's jurisdiction, making investigation and prosecution exponentially more difficult. If Wong had been taken by a Taiwanese gang, the chances of a successful rescue had just dropped significantly. Vickers immediately contacted his counterparts in Taiwan's intelligence services, requesting assistance and information sharing. The response was cautious and non-committal. Taiwan and Hong Kong had a complicated relationship in 1990, and cross-border cooperation was never guaranteed. He would have to tread carefully, balance diplomacy with urgency, and hope that someone on the other side cared enough to help. The 24-hour mark passed at 8:30 p.m. on April 11th. Still no ransom call. Still no contact. Nina Wong had moved from her husband's study to the living room, where she sat by the phone, willing it to ring. She had not eaten all day. Her hands trembled when she lifted her teacup, and the liquid sloshed onto the saucer. Members of her household staff hovered nearby, uncertain whether their presence was comforting or intrusive, but Nina seemed unaware of them entirely. She was locked in her own private hell, a place where every minute was an hour, and hope and despair warred endlessly. Vickers sat with her through the evening, his phone on the coffee table between them, both of them staring at it like it was a bomb that might detonate at any moment. He had stationed technical teams at the mansion and at police headquarters, ready to trace any call the instant it came through. He had prepared Nina as best he could for what to say, how to react, what questions to ask. But there was nothing else to do but wait. The silence was excruciating. With every hour that passed without contact, the likelihood of a successful resolution diminished. In Vickers' experience, kidnappers almost always made contact within the first 24 hours. They needed to establish their demands, create urgency, start the psychological pressure that would break down the family's resistance. Silence was unusual. Silence was wrong. Unless the thought formed unbidden in Vickers' mind, dark and terrible. Unless this wasn't really a kidnapping at all. Unless the goal had never been ransom. Unless Teddy Wong had been taken not to be held, but to be eliminated. It was possible. Wong had enemies, business rivals, disgruntled contractors, people he'd cheated or betrayed in his rise to wealth. The Chinachim Group's success had not been built on kindness. Wong was known for his ruthless business practices, his refusal to pay workers, his willingness to break contracts when convenient. He had made enemies. And enemies sometimes hired professionals to solve their problems permanently. But if that was true, then everything they were doing, the phone taps, the negotiation preparation, the waiting, was pointless. If Wong was already dead, if this elaborate abduction was just theater designed to cover a murder, then the critical 48-hour window had closed the moment he was thrown into that truck. Vickers kept this theory to himself. There was no point sharing it with Nina, not yet. She needed hope, however fragile. And besides, he could be wrong. He had to be wrong. He had to believe that somewhere in Hong Kong or Taiwan, or wherever those trucks had taken him, Teddy Wong was still alive. The clock ticked toward midnight. Hour 27, hour 28, hour 29. The critical window was closing, and still the phone did not ring. The call came at 2:17 a.m. on April 12th, 30 hours after Teddy Wong vanished into the Hong Kong night. Nina was dozing on the living room sofa when the phone's shrill ring jolted her awake. She lunged for it, nearly knocking it off the table in her desperation. Vickers' hand shot out, steadying her, reminding her with a look of everything they'd discussed. Breathe. Listen. Don't agree immediately. Ask for proof. She nodded, lifted the receiver with a trembling hand. The voice on the other end was male, speaking Mandarin with a thick accent she couldn't place. Taiwan, maybe, or southern China. The words came rapid-fire, mechanical, rehearsed. They had her husband. He was alive. They wanted 60 million Hong Kong dollars, more than 7 million US dollars. An unprecedented ransom that made even Nina's breath catch. The money was to be transferred to a bank account in Taiwan within 48 hours. If she contacted police, if she tried to trace the call, if she failed to comply exactly with their instructions, they would kill him. Then the line went dead. Vickers was already on his second phone, barking orders to the technical team. The call had come from a payphone in Shenzhen, just across the border in mainland China, too far away for any immediate action. The caller had spoken for less than 45 seconds, not nearly long enough for a precise trace. Every word had been carefully chosen to convey maximum information in minimum time. These were professionals who understood how phone tracing worked. Nina looked at Vickers with wild eyes. $60 million. 48 hours. Her husband's life hanging in the balance. She wanted to pay immediately, to wire the money that instant, to do whatever it took to get Teddy back. Vickers saw the panic building in her face, the same impulsive terror that had driven her to pay the full ransom in 1983 without negotiation. He tried to explain. They hadn't provided proof of life, no photo, no recording of Teddy's voice, nothing to confirm he was actually alive. They could be holding a corpse for ransom, banking on Nina's desperation to pay without verification. Even if Teddy was alive, paying the full amount immediately would signal that she was an easy target, a woman ruled by emotion rather than reason. And once the money was transferred to Taiwan, it would disappear into untraceable accounts, and they would have no leverage left to ensure Teddy's return. Nina heard none of it. She was already calculating how quickly she could liquidate assets, access accounts, assemble $60 million in cash or wire transfers. The sum was staggering, but the Chinachum Group was worth billions. What was money compared to her husband's life? What was negotiation compared to the possibility, the terrible possibility, that delay might cost everything? Vickers watched her face and knew he was losing the battle. Nina Wong had always been a woman of action, decisive and strong-willed. In business, those qualities had made her formidable. In a kidnapping negotiation, they made her dangerous, to herself, to her husband, to the entire investigation. Over the next 24 hours, as the clock ticked deeper into the critical 48-hour window, the investigation branched in multiple directions. Vickers' team was coordinating with Taiwanese authorities, trying to identify the bank account and track the networks behind it. Other officers were following up on the informant's tip about Taiwanese gangsters, compiling lists of known operatives with connections to Hong Kong. Financial analysts were reviewing Wong's business dealings, looking for anyone with both motive and the resources to organize such a sophisticated operation. The Taiwan connection yielded its first concrete lead at noon on April 12th. Intelligence officers identified the bank account as belonging to a shell corporation with ties to Taiwan's Military Intelligence Bureau, specifically to a serving intelligence officer named Chan. The revelation was stunning. This wasn't just organized crime. This was state-sponsored, or at least state-connected. The kidnapping had the backing of people with institutional resources, professional training, and the ability to operate across borders with impunity. The involvement of Taiwanese intelligence complicated everything. Arrests would require diplomatic coordination. Evidence would need to meet international standards. And most critically, any rescue attempt would have to navigate the treacherous waters of cross-border law enforcement, where jurisdiction was murky and cooperation was never guaranteed. Vickers absorbed this information with growing dread. He had suspected the operation was professional, but this confirmed his worst fears. The kidnapping wasn't just sophisticated, it was military-grade. The team behind it had access to intelligence networks, secure communications, and international banking systems. They had planned for months, maybe years. They had studied Wong's routines, identified his vulnerabilities, and struck with surgical precision. And they had compartmentalized the operation brilliantly. The men who snatched Wong on Magazine Gap Road were one cell. The people holding him were another cell. The financiers arranging the ransom were a third cell. Each group knew only their specific role, making it nearly impossible to roll up the entire network even if police captured some members. This wasn't just a kidnapping, it was a masterclass in operational security. The 48-hour mark approached with remorseless inevitability. At 8 p.m. on April 12th, Vickers sat in the Wong mansion's living room, watching Nina pace like a caged animal. She had made her decision. She was going to pay the ransom, all of it immediately without negotiation. She had already contacted her banks, arranged the transfers, liquidated enough assets to assemble 60 million Hong Kong dollars in cash and wire transfers. The money would be ready by morning. Vickers tried one last time to change her mind. He explained that paying without proof of life was a catastrophic mistake. He reminded her that professional kidnappers expected negotiation, that agreeing too quickly would raise suspicions and potentially endanger Teddy. He warned her that once the money was transferred, they would lose all leverage. The kidnappers could simply keep the money and kill their captive anyway. Nina listened with the patience of someone who had already made up her mind, and was simply enduring objections she had no intention of heeding. When Vickers finished, she looked at him with red-rimmed eyes and spoke words that would haunt him for the rest of his career. "I can't take that chance," she said. "I won't take that chance. If there's even a possibility that paying the ransom will bring Teddy home, I have to try. I can't live with myself otherwise." Vickers had no legal authority to stop her. The money was hers. The decision was hers. All he could do was watch helplessly as Nina Wong made the same mistake she had made 7 years earlier, the mistake of letting fear overrule strategy, emotion overrule logic. At 8:30 p.m. on April 12th, exactly 48 hours after Teddy Wong's abduction, the critical window closed. Everything that happened after this moment would be exponentially more difficult. Witness memories would have faded. Physical evidence would have degraded. The kidnappers would have had time to cover their tracks, move their captive, disappear into the vast anonymity of Asia's criminal underworld. The investigation would continue, of course. Officers would follow leads, make arrests, build cases. But the golden hours, those precious first 2 days when everything was still possible, when quick action could save lives, those hours were gone forever. And somewhere in Hong Kong or Taiwan, or on the open ocean between them, Teddy Wong's fate had already been decided. On April 26, 1990, 16 days after the abduction, Nina Wong wired 34 million Hong Kong dollars to the Taiwan bank account. She had negotiated exactly nothing. She had received no proof that her husband was alive. She had asked for no assurances, no timeline for his release, no verification whatsoever. She simply paid half the demanded ransom, perhaps hoping that this show of good faith would prompt the kidnappers to return Teddy, perhaps believing that partial payment would buy time for police to locate him. Or perhaps she had simply reached the breaking point where action, any action, was preferable to the agony of waiting. The money vanished instantly, disappearing into a labyrinth of shell corporations and offshore accounts. Within hours of the transfer, Taiwanese authorities attempted to freeze the funds, but they were already gone, moved through multiple banks, split into smaller amounts, scattered across international financial networks designed specifically to hide dirty money. Tracing it would take months, maybe years. Recovering it would be impossible. And Teddy Wong did not come home. The silence after the payment was absolute. No follow-up call. No instructions for where to find him. No demand for the remaining $30 million. Nothing. The kidnappers had taken the money and vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Nina called the bank in Taiwan obsessively, as though the account might suddenly spring back to life with new demands or messages. But the account was dormant, its purpose served. Steve Vickers had expected this outcome, but expecting something doesn't make it easier to bear. He had warned Nina that paying without proof of life was a catastrophic mistake. He had explained that professional kidnappers maintain contact throughout negotiations, that silence usually meant something had gone terribly wrong. She hadn't listened then. Now, as the days stretched into weeks with no word from the kidnappers, she finally understood what he had been trying to tell her. By late April, the case had gone ice cold. The abandoned Mercedes had yielded no useful evidence. Witnesses on Magazine Gap Road remembered nothing helpful. The kidnappers had left no trail, no clues, no mistakes. The investigation had hit walls at every turn. Witnesses who suddenly developed amnesia, informants who disappeared, leads that evaporated like morning mist. Then, on April 27th, came the arrests. Taiwanese police raided multiple locations across Taiwan, arresting 6 individuals connected to the kidnapping operation. The suspects included the intelligence officer, Chan, whose bank account had received the ransom payment. Under interrogation, the story finally began to emerge, in fragments, contradictions, and careful lies designed to minimize individual culpability while implicating others. The operation, they admitted, had been meticulously planned. Wong's routines had been studied for months. The blocking maneuver on Magazine Gap Road had been rehearsed multiple times with stolen vehicles. The cellular structure, separate teams for abduction, holding, and financial transactions, had been designed to prevent the entire network from being compromised if any one cell was captured. And Teddy Wong, they claimed, had never made it to shore. According to the suspect's statements, delivered with varying degrees of reluctance and remorse, Wang had been held on a sampan, a traditional Chinese fishing boat, somewhere in the waters between Hong Kong and Taiwan. For 3 days, he had been kept in the boat's cramped hold, bound and blindfolded. The kidnappers had waited for the ransom, growing increasingly nervous as days passed without payment. They had argued among themselves about what to do, whether to make another demand or cut their losses. Then, on the evening of April 13th, just 3 days after the abduction, a Chinese naval patrol vessel had appeared on the horizon. Panic had swept through the kidnappers. A naval inspection could lead to Wang's discovery. Discovery would mean arrest, prosecution, likely death sentences for kidnapping and potentially murder. The stakes were too high. The risk was unacceptable. So they made a decision swift, brutal, irreversible. Teddy Wang, they claimed, had been bound with weights and thrown overboard into the South China Sea. The 56-year-old billionaire, whose empire sprawled across Hong Kong and whose name appeared on buildings throughout the territory, had been dropped into dark water in the middle of the night. The sampan's engine had roared to life, and they had fled before the naval vessel came close enough to investigate. No body was ever recovered. The South China Sea keeps its secrets well. Currents, tides, and marine scavengers ensure that what goes into those waters rarely comes back recognizable. Search teams combed the area where the suspects claimed Wang had been disposed of, but found nothing. Not a body, not clothing, not even a fragment of the ropes they claimed had bound him. Vickers didn't believe the story, not entirely. The timeline was too convenient, the naval vessel too perfect as an excuse for murder. He suspected that Wang had been killed almost immediately after the abduction, that the entire ransom demand had been theater designed to cover a contract killing. Someone had wanted Teddy Wang dead. A business rival, a cheated contractor, perhaps even someone within his own family, and had hired professionals to make it look like a kidnapping gone wrong. But suspicion wasn't proof. Without a body, without witnesses, without evidence of murder beyond the kidnapper's self-serving testimony, there was no way to prove what had really happened on that sampan. The case would remain officially a kidnapping, but unofficially, everyone involved understood the truth. Teddy Wang was dead. He had probably been dead since the first 48 hours. And the man who might have saved him, Steve Vickers, with all his experience and knowledge, had been forced to watch helplessly as the critical window slammed shut. The legal proceedings dragged on for years. The arrested suspects were tried, convicted, imprisoned. Chan, the intelligence officer, received a lengthy sentence. Others claimed they were merely lookouts or drivers, minor players who hadn't known anyone would be killed. Some of those claims were probably true. The cellular structure of the operation meant many participants genuinely didn't know the full scope of what they were involved in. But the mastermind, whoever had orchestrated the entire operation, whoever had wanted Wang dead badly enough to pay for it, that person was never identified, never caught, never brought to justice. In 1999, 9 years after his disappearance, Teddy Wang was declared legally dead by Hong Kong courts. Nina Wang inherited his billions and became Asia's richest woman, a title she would hold until her own death in 2007. She never remarried. She never stopped believing, at least publicly, that Teddy might still be alive somewhere. Her personal assistant later testified that Nina had received phone calls purporting to be from Teddy well into the 2000s. Though police dismissed these as either delusions or cruel hoaxes, the inheritance sparked a decade of legal battles. Multiple wills surfaced, each leaving Wang's fortune to different beneficiaries. His father claimed one will gave him everything. Nina produced another that left everything to her. After Nina's death, her feng shui consultant produced a third will naming himself as sole heir. Courts ruled that various wills were forgeries. The Chinachim Empire was fought over by lawyers for years, generating more billable hours than most firms see in a lifetime. But through all the legal maneuvering, all the accusations and counter-accusations, one question remained unanswered. What really happened to Teddy Wang on that sampan in the South China Sea? Steve Vickers, who retired from the Hong Kong police in 1992 and opened a private security consultancy, continued to be haunted by the case. In interviews decades later, he remained convinced that Wang's second kidnapping had been a planned homicide disguised as a ransom operation. The professional execution, the Taiwanese intelligence involvement, the complete disappearance without a body, all pointed to something darker than simple greed. Of the 28 kidnapping cases he handled in his career, 26 victims came home alive. 2 did not. Teddy Wang was one of them. The failure stayed with Vickers, a reminder that even the most experienced investigator, with all the resources of law enforcement behind him, can be rendered helpless by bad luck, bad timing, and the terrible arithmetic of those first 48 hours. Because in kidnapping cases, time is everything. Every hour that passes dims the chances of recovery. Every delay, every miscommunication, every moment of hesitation can be the difference between life and death. The first 48 hours are critical not because of some arbitrary deadline, but because they represent the window when action is still possible, when trails are fresh, memories clear, evidence intact. After 48 hours, cases don't necessarily become unsolvable, but they become exponentially harder. The difference between success and failure often comes down to those first 2 days, and what investigators and families do with them. For Teddy Wang, those 48 hours were squandered. He was taken at 8:30 p.m. on April 10, 1990. By 8:30 p.m. on April 12th, his fate had been sealed, whether on that sampan, in some hidden room, or at the moment of his abduction when professionals threw him into a truck and drove into the night. The exact truth died with him, somewhere in the waters between Hong Kong and Taiwan, on a night when the moon was dark and the sea was cold and no one was watching. And in Hong Kong, high on the peak where guard dogs still patrol and a pet monkey still lives behind high walls, his mansion stands empty, a monument to wealth, power, and the brutal lesson that no amount of money can buy back time once it's gone. If you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we dive into true crime stories with calmness and respect. A special shout out to my amazing subscribers who've been with me from the start. Thank you for your incredible support. If you're still with me, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. Or just say hello so I know you're still here. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our upcoming true crime stories perfect for winding down. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. The Man Who Wanted Death. The Thomas Wayne Crump Case. Some people run from their demons. Thomas Wayne Crump invited them to stay. The maid at the Sunshine Motel had seen worse. In the transient world of Las Vegas Boulevard South, where neon signs flickered promises and disappointments in equal measure, housekeeping staff developed a certain immunity to the traces people left behind. But on October 4th, 1980, when she knocked on the door of room number 12 and received no answer, something felt different. The silence was too absolute. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the motel's faded exterior, its warmth in stark contrast to what waited inside. When the master key turned in the lock and the door swung open, the maid found herself staring into a scene that would haunt Las Vegas Metro detectives for years to come. The bathroom, always the bathroom in these cases, as if water could wash away what had been done. 26-year-old Jody Jameson lay in the bathtub, her body carefully arranged in death. Her arms and legs were bound with pantyhose pulled tight, the kind of precision that spoke of someone who had taken their time. Around her neck, strips of torn pillowcase fabric formed a loosely knotted ligature, an afterthought to work already completed. The position of the body, the staging of the scene, it all suggested something far more calculated than a moment of passion or rage. The first officers arrived within minutes. In Las Vegas, where violence plays out against the backdrop of slot machines and show lights, patrol cops learn to compartmentalize quickly. But this was different. The binding, the methodical nature of the restraints, the controlled violence evident in every detail. This was the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Someone who had likely done it before. Detective Frank Miller from the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department's Homicide Division received the call at 3:47 p.m. A veteran with nearly 15 years on the force, Miller had worked dozens of deaths in the city's underbelly. Escort services, drugs, robberies gone wrong. He'd seen the full spectrum of human depravity. But as he pulled his unmarked vehicle into the Sunshine Motel parking lot, watching the forensics van already unloading equipment, he felt the familiar weight of knowing that the next 48 hours would determine everything. In homicide investigation, time isn't just of the essence. It's the essence itself. The first critical hours in any murder investigation operate under a brutal arithmetic. Evidence degrades. Witnesses forget. Suspects flee. Every minute that ticks past is another opportunity lost. Another thread that might have led somewhere now dissolved into the chaos of daily life. Miller knew this in his bones. He'd seen cases crack wide open in the first day and others go cold before the sun had set twice. The scene told a story if you knew how to read it. The motel room itself was surprisingly orderly. No signs of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no indication of a struggle in the main room. Whatever had happened here, Jody Jameson had likely opened the door willingly. She'd come here expecting a transaction, a brief exchange of intimacy for money that kept her afloat in a city that devoured the vulnerable. Instead, she'd found something far darker. The bathroom revealed more. Water droplets still clung to the shower curtain, suggesting the tub had been used recently. Forensics would later determine that both victim and killer had been in the water together, washing up, an intimate moment that had transformed into something unspeakable. The bindings themselves told a chilling story. They were applied with care, almost ritualistic in their precision. This wasn't the panicked work of someone who killed in the heat of the moment. This was deliberate. Miller began the methodical process that would define the investigation. Every item in the room was photographed, cataloged, and analyzed. The bed sheets, rumpled but not torn. The ashtray with 2 cigarette butts, different brands. A glass on the nightstand with lipstick traces. And in the bathroom, those strips of torn pillowcase and pantyhose that had become instruments of death. The victim's personal effects told their own narrative. Her purse sat on a chair near the door, its contents seemingly undisturbed. Inside, Miller found identification that confirmed what the motel registration had already suggested. Jody Jameson worked for the Showgirls of Las Vegas Escort Service. She'd been dispatched to this room around 10 p.m. the previous night. She never called in to report that the job was complete, but in the escort business, girls sometimes went off the clock early or disappeared for days at a time. No one had worried, not until housekeeping found her cold body staring up from the porcelain. The escort service connection opened certain investigative avenues while closing others. These arrangements happened in cash, leaving minimal paper trails. Clients often used fake names, and the phone numbers they provided were usually disconnected or belonged to payphones. The service itself kept only rudimentary records, first names, callback numbers, appointment times. It was a system designed for discretion, which made it perfect for predators. As the sun began to set on that first day, Miller established a command structure for the investigation. The first 48 hours required round-the-clock staffing. Officers were assigned to canvass the motel and surrounding businesses. Had anyone seen a man leaving room 12 that morning? Had any of the other guests heard anything unusual during the night? In a place like the Sunshine Motel, where rooms rented by the hour and people came and went like shadows, witnesses were hard to come by. The medical examiner arrived to process the body. Dr. Sarah Chun had seen her share of strangulation victims, and her preliminary assessment confirmed what the scene suggested. Ligature strangulation, most likely from the improvised garrote made from the pillowcase fabric. The pantyhose bindings appeared to have been applied post-mortem or during the final moments, restraints that served as much for the killer's ritual as for controlling the victim. Time of death was estimated between midnight and 3 a.m., a window that would become crucial as the investigation developed. But there was something else, something the medical examiner noted with clinical precision. Signs suggesting the victim had been held underwater. Fluid in the lungs indicated drowning or attempted drowning. The killer's later confession would confirm this detail, but at the time, it added another layer to the psychological profile being built. This wasn't just strangulation. The killer had used multiple methods, perhaps trying different approaches, experimenting with the act of taking life. By midnight on October 4th, the first 24 hours of the critical 48-hour window, Miller and his team had established several key facts. Victim: Jody Jameson, 26 years old, employed by an escort service. No criminal record beyond minor drug possession charges. Location: Sunshine Motel, a known spot for prostitution and drug activity. Time of death: early morning hours of October 4th. Cause: ligature strangulation with possible drowning. And most importantly, they had a problem. No clear suspect, no witnesses, and a crime that had all the hallmarks of someone who'd killed before. The motel clerk, a tired man in his 50s who worked the night shift, remembered the guest who'd rented room 12, paid cash, gave the name John Smith, original, and kept to himself. Average height, average build, maybe 40 years old. The description was maddeningly generic, the kind that could fit 1,000 men walking the streets of Las Vegas at any given moment. But there was one detail that stuck. The man had a slight limp, favoring his right leg. It wasn't much, but in an investigation where every detail mattered, it was something. The second day dawned with that mixture of urgency and frustration that characterizes major investigations. The forensics team had worked through the night processing the scene. They'd lifted fingerprints from the room, dozens of them, overlapping and smudged, the accumulated traces of countless guests who'd passed through. Sorting through them would take days, and even then, they'd only be useful if the killer's prints were already in the system. Miller expanded the canvas operation. Officers showed Jody Jameson's photo at nearby businesses, motels, and bars. Had anyone seen her the night she died? Had she been with anyone? The responses were depressingly similar. Maybe, possibly, we see a lot of girls like her. In a city built on transience and anonymity, Jody Jameson was just another young woman trying to survive, and her death was just another tragedy in a place that manufactured them with industrial efficiency. The escort service provided what little information they had. The call had come in around 9:30 p.m. on October 3rd. A man asking for an escort, cash only, willing to pay the premium for an overnight stay. They'd dispatched Jody because she was available and experienced. The phone number he'd provided traced back to a payphone at a gas station 3 blocks from the motel. Dead end. Detectives visited the gas station, showing the clerk a composite sketch based on the motel clerk's description. The gas station attendant shrugged. Hundreds of people used that phone every day. But Miller pressed, and eventually a detail emerged. A man matching the description had been there around 9 p.m. on the 3rd, seemed agitated, kept looking over his shoulder while he made his call. It wasn't much, but it confirmed that the killer had been careful, using a public phone to avoid any direct connection to himself. As the 48-hour mark approached, Miller found himself facing a harsh reality. They had a victim, a crime scene, and a vague description. They had the methodical nature of the killing, which suggested experience. They had the discipline the killer showed in using cash, public phones, and a fake name. What they didn't have was a suspect. And in Las Vegas, a city where 30 million visitors pass through every year, a man could commit murder and disappear into the crowd like smoke. The case would require patience, persistence, and a break. The kind that sometimes comes in the first 48 hours but sometimes takes years. Miller didn't know it then, but Thomas Wayne Crump was already far from Las Vegas, having fled to Albuquerque the day after Jody Jameson's death. He would kill again, and again, and it would take 3 more years and a confession from a prison cell before the pieces would finally fall into place. But that first 48 hours had established the foundation. The evidence was preserved. The witnesses, such as they were, had been interviewed. The timeline was constructed. And somewhere in the massive file that was growing on Miller's desk, there were threads that would eventually connect to a pattern of violence stretching back decades, a pattern that had passed through multiple states, a pattern that belonged to a man who later said he'd been killing since he was 16 years old. The Sunshine Motel case would go cold, but it wouldn't go away. That's the thing about the first 48 hours in a homicide investigation. They don't just serve the immediate needs of solving the case. They create a record, a foundation that future investigators can build upon. Every photograph, every witness statement, every piece of evidence carefully cataloged and preserved becomes part of a larger tapestry. And sometimes, years later, when a suspect finally emerges, it's those first critical hours of work that provide the roadmap to conviction. Thomas Wayne Crump wasn't born a killer, but he'd been practicing the role since his teenage years in Muncie, Indiana. Born in 1940, he'd grown up in post-war America, a time when the nation was trying to heal itself while papering over the wounds that would eventually tear it apart. Crump's early years were marked by small-time crime, car theft with his friends Larry Morris and William Wagner, petty burglaries, the kind of juvenile delinquency that was common enough in working-class neighborhoods. But there were signs if anyone had looked closely enough. In 1958, at just 18 years old, Crump was charged with attempting to kill a woman who'd had a dispute with his mother. The details were murky, the prosecution weak, and Crump walked away with a warning. A year later, he stole 4 cars in 48 hours, a spree that showed not just criminality but a certain reckless compulsion. Again, he avoided serious consequences. The pattern was established early. Crump could commit crimes and slip through the cracks of a justice system that was overworked and under-resourced. By 1962, after a string of increasingly serious offenses, he finally received a prison sentence, 1 to 5 years for robbery. It should have been a turning point, a chance for rehabilitation. Instead, it was graduate school. Prison hardened Crump, taught him new skills, introduced him to men who saw violence as a viable life strategy. When he was released in 1966, he had a young son and briefly tried to maintain the appearance of normalcy. It didn't last. The violence escalated. In 1967, Crump robbed a clerk in Albuquerque and left the man for dead. He fled to Michigan, where a waitress made the mistake of asking for his ID. Crump responded by stabbing her 10 times. Miraculously, she survived, but Crump's rage was becoming harder to contain. He was convicted of attempted murder and sent to a Michigan prison, where he served time before being released again into a society that had no idea what to do with men like him. By 1976, Crump was back in Albuquerque, working construction and eventually managing a KFC restaurant. It was there that he met 16-year-old Rhonda Higdon, a young employee who developed feelings for him. To those who knew them casually, they seemed like an unlikely but genuine couple. Crump, in his mid-30s, appeared to have finally found some stability. They eventually got engaged. It was a facade. In July 1980, Crump's mask slipped completely off. The relationship with Rhonda was ending. She'd begun to see the darkness beneath his surface, the anger that could ignite over nothing, the control that masqueraded as love. When she tried to break off the engagement, Crump couldn't accept it. On July 31st, 1980, he asked to take her out one final time. Rhonda, perhaps hoping for a peaceful resolution, agreed. He drove her to the Rio Grande, far from help, far from witnesses. There, in the dusty New Mexico landscape, he ordered her out of the car. Then he pulled out a 9mm automatic and shot her 5 times. He hid her body in a nearby ditch and drove away, leaving the young woman who trusted him to rot under the desert sun. For Crump, it was a line crossed, a boundary dissolved. If killing Rhonda should have destroyed him with guilt, it did the opposite. Freed him. The timing is important here, crucial to understanding what happened in Las Vegas 2 months later. Crump killed Rhonda on July 31st, 1980. Jody Jameson died on October 4th, 1980. In between, there were other victims, other attempts. On September 9th, Crump was hitchhiking when a 58-year-old man picked him up. In thanks, Crump sliced the man's throat and stole $600. Somehow, impossibly, the man survived. Crump took his truck and headed west to Nevada. He arrived in Las Vegas with blood on his hands, metaphorically and perhaps literally, and a wallet containing stolen money. The city welcomed him as it welcomes everyone, with indifference and opportunity. He checked into the Sunshine Motel, a place that asked no questions, and placed a call to an escort service. When Jody Jameson arrived, Crump was already a murderer several times over. What happened in room 12 wasn't his first killing, and it wouldn't be his last. The escort service records would later show that Crump, using his fake name, had made specific requests. He wanted someone who'd stay the whole night, someone who wouldn't rush the experience. He was, the service dispatcher remembered, polite on the phone, soft-spoken even. These details would become important later, but at the time, they were just notes in a file. What happened in that motel room unfolded over several hours. They had sex. Jody's beeper kept going off. Other calls, other clients, the logistics of a life lived in increments. They moved to the bathroom to clean up. And it was there, in that cramped space with its institutional white tiles and aging fixtures, that someone entered the room and stole Crump's money. Or so he claimed. Crump would later insist in his confession that someone, perhaps another client, perhaps someone Jody was working with, had slipped into the room while they were in the bathroom and taken a substantial amount of cash. It was a setup, a trick roll in the parlance of the street, and Crump felt betrayed. Whether this actually happened or whether it was a paranoid delusion or a convenient justification, no one would ever know for certain. But for Crump, it became the spark that ignited his rage. He accused Jody of being part of the scheme. She denied it, confused and probably frightened. But denial wasn't enough for Crump. In his mind, she'd conspired to rob him, and there could be only one response. He grabbed her, forced her head underwater in the bathtub. The struggle was brief. He was stronger, angrier, unstoppable. Then came the restraints, the pantyhose binding her limbs, the torn pillowcase strips fashioned into a garrote. Even as she died or lay dead, he continued, completing some internal ritual that only he understood. What he did next revealed the practiced nature of his violence. He didn't panic. He didn't flee immediately. Instead, he carefully arranged the scene, cleaned up after himself, and calmly left the motel room. The housekeeping maid wouldn't discover the body for nearly 12 hours. By then, Crump was already gone. But he didn't go far. That same day, October 4th, Crump opened fire on his two roommates at the motel. Both survived, though how remains something of a miracle. For reasons that only made sense in Crump's fractured psychology, he decided these men needed to die. Perhaps they'd seen something. Perhaps they were simply convenient targets for a rage that was now burning unchecked. The gunshots brought police, but Crump fled before they arrived, making his way back to Albuquerque. 4 days later, on October 8, 1980, a 78-year-old man named Irving Plaisted, visiting from Minnesota, made the fatal mistake of being helpful. Crump asked him for directions. Plaisted, being a decent person, offered him a ride. Once inside the vehicle, Crump robbed him, shot him in the chest, and then, when Plaisted didn't die immediately, shot him in the head. He left the elderly tourist's body on the outskirts of Albuquerque and drove away in Plaisted's car. 2 days after that, Crump robbed a flower shop, making off with $17,000 worth of merchandise that he immediately pawned for a fraction of its value. By mid-October 1980, he was wanted for multiple murders and violent crimes across 2 states. And yet, he remained free, moving through the Southwest like a ghost, leaving bodies and trauma in his wake. The pattern was clear to anyone who looked at it with fresh eyes. Thomas Wayne Crump was escalating. The gaps between his violent acts were shrinking. The violence itself was becoming more brazen, less calculated. He was devolving, shedding whatever thin veneer of civilization he'd maintained. But in 1980, with different police departments working different cases across state lines, with no computerized database to connect the dots, Crump existed as separate incidents in separate jurisdictions. No one had put it all together yet. On November 16, 1980, less than 2 months after Jody Jameson's death, Crump got into a fight at a motel in Albuquerque. Police were called to break it up. When they ran his information, the system lit up like a Christmas tree. Warrants, multiple jurisdictions, violent offenses. They arrested him on the spot, and under questioning, Crump did something unexpected. He confessed, not just to one crime or two, but to the entire spree. Rhonda, the man with the slashed throat, Irving Plaisted, the flower shop robbery. He laid it all out with a chilling matter-of-factness. But he didn't mention Jody Jameson. That case, hundreds of miles away in Las Vegas, remained unsolved. The connection wouldn't be made for years, Not until Crump confessed again from behind bars, adding her name to the list of people whose lives he'd stolen. For Detective Miller and his team, the case would remain frustratingly open, one of those files that sits in a drawer, never quite closed, never quite forgotten. Thomas Wayne Crump entered the New Mexico State prison system in 1981, convicted of murdering his wife Rhonda and Irving Plaisted. 2 life sentences, it should have been the end of the story. But for men like Crump, prison walls aren't barriers so much as temporary inconveniences. He'd spent much of his adult life incarcerated, and he knew the system's rhythms, its weaknesses, its opportunities. The penitentiary of New Mexico in Santa Fe was, in the early 1980s, a powder keg. Overcrowded, understaffed, and rife with violence, it had been the site of the infamous 1980 prison riot that left 33 inmates dead and hundreds injured. Crump arrived in its aftermath, when the institution was still recovering, still trying to impose order on chaos. To a predator like him, it was almost welcoming. He wasted no time making his presence felt. In 1981, just months into his sentence, Crump participated in an attack on 3 prison guards. The assault was brutal and coordinated, the kind of violence that happens when inmates sense vulnerability. One guard, 33-year-old Gerald McGee, didn't survive. The others were hospitalized with severe injuries. Crump added another murder to his record, but he was already serving 2 life sentences. What difference did another conviction make? The attack on the guards revealed something crucial about Crump's psychology. He wasn't interested in redemption or rehabilitation. He'd later tell investigators, with chilling honesty, that prison time meant nothing to him. He could do decades standing on his head. Time was irrelevant when you'd already surrendered any hope of a normal life. All that mattered was control. The ability to exercise power over others, to inflict pain, to remind himself and everyone around him that he was still dangerous. On June 17, 1982, Crump made his move. He was working in the prison kitchen, assigned to make pumpkin pies, a mundane task that required him to be unchained from his ankle shackles for practical reasons. Somehow, through a combination of ingenuity and opportunity, he managed to slip out of the 10-inch shackle that was supposed to keep him secure. The exact mechanics of his escape remain unclear. Prison officials would later face questions about how an inmate serving multiple life sentences for murder could simply walk away from a medium-security kitchen detail. But walk away he did. Crump didn't get far on foot, but far enough. Within hours, he'd made his way to Albuquerque, a city he knew well, a city where he'd killed before. And there, in a terrible echo of his earlier crimes, he flagged down a cab. The driver was Steve Hewitt, a 22-year-old trying to make a living in a tough economy. Crump jumped in, pulled a gun, and introduced himself with chilling arrogance. "I want you to know I'm Thomas Wayne Crump." Then he shot Hewitt twice in the head. By any reasonable measure, Steve Hewitt should have died that night. 2 bullets to the skull, fired at close range by a man with nothing to lose. It was an execution plain and simple. But in one of those inexplicable miracles that occasionally punctuate true crime narratives, both bullets bounced off Hewitt's skull. He survived, traumatized and wounded but alive. Crump fled into the night, probably believing he'd left another corpse behind. Hours later, he tried again. Another cab, another driver. This time it was Ian Smith, 44 years old, a man with a family who depended on his income from driving the late shifts. When Crump jumped in and pulled his weapon, Smith did something Hewitt hadn't had time to do. He fought back. The struggle was violent and desperate. In the chaos, Crump accidentally shot himself in the right shoulder, the pain enraging him further. But he fought through it and managed to shoot Smith, who died quickly from his wounds. Crump staggered into a nearby motel, bleeding from his self-inflicted gunshot wound, crying in pain. The staff found him collapsed on the floor and called police. Officers arrived within minutes and found him babbling, still armed, still dangerous even in his injured state. They arrested him without incident. He was too weak to resist, and immediately began searching the area. That's when they found Ian Smith's cab. The driver slumped over the wheel, already dead. A bloodied victim and a bloody suspect, all in one terrible night. The shooting of two cab drivers within hours of each other, coming immediately after a daring prison escape, made headlines across New Mexico. Crump was now notorious, his name synonymous with senseless violence. He was convicted of Smith's murder and the attempted murder of Hewitt, adding another life sentence and 62 years to his existing time. This time, he was sent to maximum security, but even that wasn't enough to contain the threat he represented. While Crump sat in his cell, Detective Miller in Las Vegas was still working the Jody Jameson case. It was now 1983, 3 years since her body had been found in that bathtub at the Sunshine Motel. The case had gone cold, but Miller hadn't given up. He'd continued to review the evidence, looking for connections, following up on leads that went nowhere. And then he got the call that would change everything. A Metropolitan Police Department homicide detective had been reviewing unsolved cases from 1980, looking for patterns, when he noticed something interesting. A man named Thomas Wayne Crump, currently serving multiple life sentences in New Mexico, had been in Las Vegas in October 1980. He'd stayed at a motel, had roommates, had gotten into violent altercations, and he'd been in the area right around the time Jody Jameson was killed. It was a long shot, the kind of connection that could easily be coincidental. But Miller had learned to trust these hunches, these thin threads that sometimes led somewhere important. He reached out to the New Mexico Department of Corrections and arranged to interview Crump. When Miller arrived at the prison, he had no idea that Crump was already preparing to unburden himself of secrets he'd been carrying for years. The interview took place in a small, windowless room that smelled of disinfectant and sweat. Crump sat across from Miller, his hands cuffed to a chain around his waist, his expression flat and unreadable. Miller began with standard questions, establishing rapport, feeling out whether this was going to be a cooperative interview or a waste of time. And then, unexpectedly, Crump started talking. He confessed to Jody Jameson's murder with a casualness that was disturbing. He described the motel room, the escort service, the beeper that kept going off during sex. He explained about the stolen money, or what he believed was stolen money, and how he decided that Jody had to die for it. He described holding her head underwater in the bathtub, binding her with pantyhose, fashioning the garrote from torn pillowcase. He was matter-of-fact, almost clinical, as if discussing something that had happened to someone else. But Miller needed more than a confession. He needed details that only the killer would know, information that hadn't been released to the public. So he pressed, and Crump delivered. He described the arrangement of the bathroom, the specific way he'd tied the bindings, the fact that Jody's beeper had been on the nightstand next to her purse. These weren't details anyone could have guessed or read in a newspaper. They were the hallmarks of someone who'd been there, who'd done these things. The confession was recorded on videotape, a practice that was becoming standard in major cases. The video captured not just Crump's words but his demeanor, the flat effect, the occasional smirk, the complete absence of remorse. At one point, Miller asked him if he felt anything about what he'd done to Jody Jameson. Crump's response was chilling. "She deserved what she got. I don't feel no remorse over it. I could have obtained my money without killing her. I just wanted to kill her." That last phrase, "I just wanted to kill her," cut through all the rationalizations about stolen money and betrayal. Crump didn't kill Jody Jameson because she'd wronged him. He killed her because he wanted to, because the opportunity presented itself, because he'd already killed before and found that he liked it. The stolen money, if it existed at all, was just an excuse. But the interview didn't stop with Jody Jameson. Once Crump started talking, he couldn't seem to stop. He confessed to 7 murders in total, 7 attempted murders, and countless robberies, assaults, and kidnappings spanning decades. He talked about his first robbery at age 12, about killing a priest when he was 16. He described crimes that police didn't even know had occurred, cases that would never be solved because the victims were too long dead and the evidence too degraded. Miller listened, took notes, and felt a strange mix of satisfaction and horror. He'd solved the Jody Jameson case, closed a file that had haunted him for 3 years. But the cost of that closure was learning just how prolific a killer Crump had been, how many lives he'd destroyed, how many families he'd shattered. And there was something else in Crump's words that disturbed Miller even more. the complete absence of regret. Near the end of the interview, Crump made a request that would later become crucial at his Nevada trial. He said simply and directly that he wanted the death penalty. He explained that if he was ever released, he would kill again. It wasn't a threat or a bargaining tactic. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the same flat certainty he'd used to describe his crimes. Prison time meant nothing to him. If given the opportunity, he would escape again, hurt someone again, kill again. The only way to stop him, he insisted, was to execute him. Miller left the prison that day with what he'd come for: a confession that would stand up in court, closure for Jody Jameson's case, and evidence that would lead to Crump's extradition to Nevada to face trial. But he also left with something heavier: the knowledge that evil like Crump's wasn't born of circumstance or desperation. It was elemental, rooted in something broken beyond repair. Some people, Miller realized, couldn't be saved or reformed. They could only be stopped. Extraditing Thomas Wayne Crump from New Mexico to Nevada in 1984 required navigating a complex legal process. He was already serving multiple life sentences, and New Mexico prosecutors were reluctant to let him go, even temporarily. But Nevada had a stronger case for seeking the death penalty, and ultimately the paperwork was processed. Crump was transported to Las Vegas to stand trial for the murder of Jody Jameson. The trial began on April 23, 1984, in Clark County District Court. The courtroom was packed with media, law enforcement, and curious observers who'd heard about the monster being brought to justice. Crump sat at the defense table with his attorney, Richard Maurer, appearing calm and almost detached. He'd been through the system enough times to know how it worked, and he seemed unconcerned about the outcome. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorneys James Tuffland and Daniel Seaton, had a straightforward strategy. They would present the physical evidence from the crime scene, the forensic analysis, and most devastatingly, Crump's own videotaped confession. The defense's job was nearly impossible. How do you defend a man who'd confessed not just to one murder but to being a serial killer? Maura's strategy focused on questioning the voluntariness of the confession and challenging the death penalty itself, but he was fighting an uphill battle. The jury, 7 women and 5 men, watched as prosecutors methodically built their case. Crime scene photographs showed Jody Jameson's body in the bathtub, the bindings, the ligature. The medical examiner testified about the cause of death, the signs of drowning, the methodical nature of the strangulation. Detectives described the investigation, the dead ends, the years of frustration before Crump's confession broke the case open. And then came the videotape. For the jurors, watching Crump describe what he'd done to Jody Jameson was transformative. This wasn't a case where they had to imagine the defendant's guilt or reconstruct events from circumstantial evidence. Here was the killer himself, calmly explaining how he drowned her, bound her, strangled her. His words were matter of fact, his demeanor chilling. Several jurors later said they'd never seen anything quite like it. A man so completely divorced from normal human emotion that he could discuss murder as casually as someone might describe their commute to work. The defense tried to raise doubts about the confession's reliability, suggesting that Crump had been coerced or that he was mentally ill and not fully responsible for his actions. But the prosecution countered effectively. The confession included details only the killer could have known. Crump had been read his rights multiple times and had never asked for the questioning to stop. And as for mental illness, the state's psychiatric experts testified that while Crump certainly had personality disorders, he was competent, understood right from wrong, and had demonstrated clear premeditation in his crimes. On April 26, 1984, after less than a day of deliberations, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder and robbery, both with the use of a deadly weapon. The conviction was never in doubt, but now came the more difficult phase: deciding whether Crump should live or die. Nevada's death penalty statute required the jury to consider aggravating and mitigating circumstances. The prosecution had a wealth of aggravating factors to present. First, Crump had previously been convicted of murders and violent felonies. The crimes in New Mexico had already resulted in multiple life sentences. Second, the murder of Jody Jameson occurred during the commission of a robbery. And third, The murder involved depravity of mind, a legal term that described the particular cruelty and callousness Crump had displayed. But it was the second videotaped confession, recorded during the same interview with Detective Miller, that sealed Crump's fate. In this tape, shown during the penalty phase, Crump spoke at length about his life of crime. He confessed to 7 murders, 7 attempted murders, and innumerable other violent acts. He talked about participating in the prison riot that killed a guard. He described escaping from prison and immediately killing again. And then he said the words that would echo through the courtroom: "I would escape if you give me the opportunity. Time is nothing. Penitentiary time doesn't affect me at all. If I was to get out of here today, I'd hurt somebody today." There it was, in his own words. A promise that he would kill again if given the chance. The jury heard him say it. They saw the look in his eyes, the complete absence of remorse or rehabilitation. And they heard his final statement, the one that seemed to seal his request for death. "I would like the death penalty because I deserve it. I don't want to hurt nobody else." The prosecution also called Jerome Strickland, who testified about witnessing Crump kill his roommate, Ernie Ritchie, during one of the earlier violent incidents. Strickland's testimony was powerful because it showed the jury that Crump's violence wasn't theoretical or historical. It was ongoing, uncontrollable, certain to continue. The defense objected to this testimony because Crump hadn't been convicted of Ritchie's murder, but the judge allowed it under Nevada law, which permitted such evidence during the penalty phase to help the jury understand the full scope of the defendant's dangerousness. The defense presented mitigation evidence, trying to paint a picture of a man shaped by circumstance. They talked about Crump's difficult childhood, his early exposure to the criminal justice system, the failures of rehabilitation programs. They brought in a psychologist who testified about antisocial personality disorder, about how Crump's psychology had been warped by decades of incarceration. But against the mountain of evidence about Crump's crimes, these arguments felt hollow. The jury deliberated on the penalty for 2 days. It wasn't that they struggled with the decision. The outcome was never really in doubt, but the weight of deciding whether another human being should live or die required careful consideration. They reviewed the aggravating circumstances, the previous murders, the depravity, the robbery connection. They considered the mitigating factors the defense had presented, and they found that the aggravating circumstances far outweighed any mitigation. On May 2, 1984, the jury returned with their recommendation: death. The courtroom erupted in a mix of relief and somber acknowledgement. Some of Jody Jameson's family members cried, finally seeing justice for a young woman whose life had been stolen in that motel room nearly 4 years earlier. Crump himself showed no reaction, his expression remaining as flat and unreadable as it had been throughout the trial. Judge Paul S. Goldman formally sentenced Crump to death on May 8, 1984. In addition to the death sentence for the murder conviction, Crump received 2 consecutive 15-year terms for the robbery with use of a deadly weapon. The judge's words were measured but firm. This was a man who had demonstrated, repeatedly and without question, that he was a continuing threat to society. The death penalty was not just appropriate but necessary. Crump would spend the next 34 years on death row at the Nevada State Prison, later transferred to the Northern Nevada Correctional Center. True to his word, he never stopped trying to escape. He filed multiple appeals, challenging his conviction and sentence through every available legal avenue. The Nevada Supreme Court upheld his conviction in 1986. He appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, which refused to hear his case. He filed habeas corpus petitions, challenging his trial attorney's effectiveness, the admission of evidence, the jury instructions. Every appeal was denied. During those decades on death row, Crump gave occasional interviews to reporters. In a 1984 interview with the Las Vegas Review-Journal, he remained unrepentant. When asked why he felt no remorse, he said, "I don't know. I have no idea. I've searched for that why for so many years." But his search seemed more intellectual curiosity than genuine soul-searching. He knew what he was, even if he couldn't explain how he'd become that way. For the investigators who'd worked his cases, Detective Miller in Las Vegas, the prosecutors in Nevada, the countless law enforcement officers who documented his crimes across multiple states. Crump represented something both familiar and alien. Familiar because he fit certain patterns they'd seen in other violent offenders. The childhood escalation, the inability to function in normal society, the progressive desensitization to violence. Alien because of the sheer scope of his destruction and his chilling self-awareness. Most killers either denied their actions or constructed elaborate justifications. Crump did neither. He killed because he wanted to, because he could, because it satisfied something in him that nothing else could reach. The families of his victims, Rhonda Higdon, Irving Plaisted, Ian Smith, Jody Jameson, and so many others, had to live with the knowledge that Crump was still alive, still breathing, still existing in some form while their loved ones were gone forever. The appeals process, which dragged on for decades, meant they could never fully move on. Every legal filing was a reminder, every hearing a reopening of wounds that never quite healed. On June 14, 2018, 34 years after being sentenced to death, Thomas Wayne Crump died at a medical facility inside the Northern Nevada Correctional Center. He was 78 years old. The cause of death was listed as natural causes, a heart that finally stopped, a body that finally gave out. He never faced execution. The legal system, with its endless appeals and stays, had outlived him. His death prompted mixed reactions. Some of his victims' families felt cheated that he hadn't been executed as sentenced, that he'd been allowed to live out his natural life while those he'd killed never had that chance. Others felt a sense of closure simply knowing he was finally gone, that he could never hurt anyone again. Detective Miller, retired by then but still following the case, told a reporter that he felt mostly relief. The monster was dead. That was enough. Looking back at the case from the perspective of decades, several things become clear. The first 48 hours in the Jody Jameson investigation established a foundation that proved crucial years later when Crump finally confessed. The careful documentation of the crime scene, the preservation of evidence, the witness interviews, all of it created a record that could be matched against Crump's confession, verifying its accuracy and ensuring that it would hold up in court. But the case also highlighted systemic failures that allowed Crump to kill for so long. He should have been stopped after his first serious violent offense in 1958. He should have been identified as a continuing threat after the 1967 robbery and stabbing. He should have been kept in maximum security after his first life sentences in New Mexico. At every turn, the justice system had opportunities to prevent future violence, and at every turn, it failed. Crump slipped through the cracks, exploited weaknesses in the system, and left a trail of bodies across multiple states. The development of computerized criminal databases in the 1980s and 90s, the creation of task forces to track serial offenders, the improvement in forensic technology. All of these advances came too late to prevent Crump's crimes but were partly inspired by cases like his. Law enforcement learned from failures like the Jody Jameson investigation, where a killer could murder in Las Vegas and then flee to New Mexico without anyone initially connecting the crimes. In the end, Thomas Wayne Crump's legacy is measured in the lives he destroyed and the lessons learned from his decades of violence. He killed at least 7 people, possibly more. He terrorized communities across multiple states. He demonstrated with brutal clarity that some people are simply incompatible with civilized society, that rehabilitation isn't always possible, that evil exists not just as a concept but as a lived reality in the actions of men who choose violence over humanity. Jody Jameson was 26 when she died. She was someone's daughter, someone's friend, a young woman trying to survive in a difficult world. She took a call from an escort service and ended up in a bathtub, bound and strangled. Her life stolen by a man who felt nothing but the desire to kill. The first 48 hours of the investigation into her death couldn't save her, but they ensured that eventually justice would be served. That her killer would be caught, tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. Detective Miller kept a file on his desk for years after Crump's conviction. It contained photos of the Sunshine Motel, evidence reports, witness statements, and a copy of that damning videotaped confession. Sometimes, late at night when the office was empty, he'd open the file and look through it, reminding himself why he did this work. Not for the glory or the solved cases or the accolades, but for the victims. For Jody and all the others who deserved someone to remember them, someone to fight for them, someone to ensure that their killers didn't walk free. That file is now archived in the Clark County records, part of the historical documentation of Las Vegas crime. But the lessons it contains remain relevant. The first 48 hours matter. The careful collection of evidence matters. The persistence of investigators who refuse to let cases go cold matters. And most of all, the recognition that justice, even when delayed, even when imperfect, is worth pursuing matters. Thomas Wayne Crump is gone now, his body cremated, his name slowly fading from public memory. But the people he killed, they remain. They remain in the memories of those who loved them, in the cold case files that document their deaths, in the collective consciousness of a society that must grapple with the reality that monsters walk among us, wearing human faces, hiding in plain sight, waiting for opportunities to feed their hunger for violence. The Jody Jameson case serves as a grim reminder. Evil exists, and it requires constant vigilance to combat. The first 48 hours of any investigation are critical because they set the foundation for everything that follows. Evidence collected with care, witnesses interviewed with patience, scenes documented with precision. These aren't just procedural necessities. They're acts of remembrance, ways of honoring victims by ensuring their deaths are not forgotten, that their killers are held accountable. In the end, that's what justice is. Remembering the dead, catching the guilty, and trying, however imperfectly, to create a world where fewer people suffer the fate that Jody Jameson suffered in that motel room on October 4th, 1980. A world where the first 48 hours lead not to cold cases and unsolved mysteries, but to resolution, accountability, and the small comfort of knowing that someone cared enough to see it through. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to hear where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story to help you drift off to sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. The Vanishing Shadow. The Michael Dunahy Enigma. On a spring morning when blossoms decorated every branch and laughter echoed across playgrounds throughout Victoria, British Columbia, a 4-year-old boy with sandy hair and bright eyes became a ghost, present one heartbeat, absent the next, leaving behind only footprints in the wood chips and a silence that would haunt a nation for decades. What you're about to hear isn't just another case of a missing child. This is the story of how 72 seconds, barely longer than a commercial break, can erase a human being from existence, how a community can search every shadow and interrogate every stranger, how thousands of leads can materialize into nothing but smoke, and how one family's nightmare became an entire country's obsession. Michael Dunahy didn't vanish into the woods or disappear down a lonely road. He evaporated from a crowded athletic field surrounded by parents, children, and witnesses in the full light of day, as if reality itself had opened a doorway and swallowed him whole. This is about the hunt for answers that never came, the theories that multiplied like dark flowers, the suspects who emerged and dissolved like phantoms, and the terrifying possibility that whoever took Michael might have been hiding in plain sight all along. Perhaps even watching the searches, perhaps even joining them. What happened in those 72 seconds? Where did Michael Dunahy go? And more disturbingly, who was watching, waiting, and calculating the precise moment when a small boy would be vulnerable enough to snatch from reality itself? March 24th, 1991 arrived in Victoria, British Columbia, wearing the gentleness of early spring. Cherry blossoms hung heavy on their branches, petals drifting through crisp air that smelled of fresh earth and possibility. At Blanchard Elementary School's athletic grounds, parents gathered for a routine event. Nothing extraordinary, nothing remarkable, just another Tuesday morning where children would play and adults would supervise. The normalcy of it all would later become its most haunting feature. Crystal Dunahy arrived at the Blanchard Park athletic field shortly after 10:30 that morning, her 4-year-old son Michael bouncing with the boundless energy that defines childhood. The boy possessed features that would become tragically familiar to millions. Sandy blonde hair that caught sunlight like spun gold, bright hazel eyes that sparkled with curiosity, a small birthmark on his left calf, and a gap-toothed smile that radiated pure innocence. He wore a blue hooded sweatshirt bearing the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, those cartoon heroes so beloved by children of that era, along with blue track pants striped with white and small sneakers that had carried him through countless adventures in his short existence. The athletic field bustled with activity that morning. Parents clustered in conversation while children darted between playground equipment, their laughter creating a soundtrack of innocence. Crystal watched her son navigate toward the playground area, his small frame moving with the confidence of a child who believed the world existed solely for exploration and joy. She stood approximately 150 feet away, well within visual range, surrounded by dozens of other adults whose presence created an illusion of safety, a collective watchfulness that should have made the unthinkable impossible. What happened next has been dissected, analyzed, reconstructed, and questioned for more than 3 decades, yet it remains fundamentally incomprehensible. Michael moved toward the playground equipment, his small legs pumping with purpose. Crystal turned her attention away for perhaps 72 seconds. Some accounts suggest it might have been slightly longer. Others insist it was shorter. A span of time so brief it barely registers in consciousness, yet long enough for reality to fracture irreparably. When Crystal's gaze returned to where her son should have been playing, emptiness greeted her. The space Michael had occupied moments before contained only air and absence. Her eyes swept the playground frantically, searching for that distinctive blue sweatshirt, that blonde hair catching sunlight. Nothing. The mothers who stood nearby hadn't seen anything unusual. The children playing nearby continued their games, oblivious. Michael Dunahy had simply ceased to exist in that location, as thoroughly as if he had never been there at all. The initial response followed the pattern of parental panic when a child temporarily disappears. Perhaps he had wandered behind equipment, maybe he was hiding, surely he was somewhere close by. Crystal called his name, her voice rising with each repetition. Other parents joined the search, fanning out across the athletic field with growing urgency. Minutes accumulated, each one transforming hope into dread, certainty into desperation. By the time authorities received notification, precious minutes had already evaporated. Police officers arrived to find a scene of controlled chaos. Parents searching frantically, children being gathered and questioned, the playground equipment standing like silent witnesses to whatever had occurred. The circumstances defied logical explanation. Michael hadn't wandered away. 4-year-olds don't cover significant distances in 72 seconds. He hadn't hidden successfully. Children that age rarely possess the discipline or inclination for sustained concealment. Someone had taken him. That became the only conclusion that fit the impossible facts. Within hours, Blanchard Elementary School transformed into a command center. Police officers cordoned off areas, questioned witnesses, and began constructing timelines. The surrounding neighborhood received immediate attention as investigators knocked on doors, examined yards, and searched any location a small child might be concealed. The urgency was palpable and justified. Statistics regarding missing children are merciless, particularly in those crucial first hours when recovery remains possible. As daylight faded on March 24th, the search expanded exponentially. Volunteers arrived in waves, ordinary citizens transforming into desperate searchers combing through parks, alleys, wooded areas, and any space that might conceal a 4-year-old boy. Dogs trained in tracking followed scent trails that led nowhere conclusive. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging equipment swept overhead, their searchlights cutting through darkness. The entire apparatus of law enforcement mobilized with singular focus. Find Michael Dunahy. The media descended rapidly, transforming a local tragedy into national news. Michael's photograph appeared on television screens across Canada, his innocent face staring out at millions of viewers. The details of his disappearance received exhaustive coverage. The crowded athletic field, the brief span of inattention, the complete absence of witnesses who saw anything suspicious. Journalists interviewed Crystal and Bruce Dunahy, Michael's parents, whose raw anguish became painfully public. Their pleas for Michael's safe return echoed through living rooms nationwide, creating a collective awareness that would endure for decades. The Blanchard Park area underwent microscopic examination. Investigators measured distances, calculated sight lines, interviewed every adult who had been present that morning, and spoke with children whose memories might contain crucial details. The athletic field revealed no physical evidence, no signs of struggle, no dropped items, no disturbed earth or trampled grass that might indicate where Michael had been taken or in which direction his abductor had fled. The absence of evidence became its own form of testimony, suggesting either extraordinary luck or careful planning. Theories emerged rapidly, each one attempting to impose logic onto the illogical. Had someone been watching Michael specifically, waiting for an opportunity? Had a predator been surveilling the athletic field, seeking any vulnerable child? Could this have been a planned abduction or an impulsive crime of opportunity? Each possibility carried its own terrifying implications. A planned kidnapping suggested premeditation, surveillance, and calculated patience. An opportunistic abduction implied a predator moving through society undetected, ready to strike whenever circumstances aligned. As the first night without Michael descended upon Victoria, the Dunahy family experienced a nightmare that would never truly end. Their home, which should have contained the sounds of a 4-year-old's bedtime routine, filled instead with silence and the constant presence of police officers coordinating the search. Michael's empty bed became an accusation. His toys scattered throughout rooms he would never return to. The sheer ordinariness of the morning, the routine nature of visiting an athletic field on a Tuesday, amplified the horror. Danger had been lurking in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses, waiting for 72 seconds of opportunity. The community's response reflected both the best and most desperate aspects of human nature. Volunteers organized search parties that continued around the clock. Business owners posted Michael's photograph in windows throughout Victoria and beyond. Prayer vigils drew hundreds of attendees who held candles and hoped for miracles. The collective determination to find Michael and return him safely to his family created a wave of purpose that seemed unstoppable. Surely this many people searching, this much attention focused on finding one small boy, would yield results. But as dawn broke on March 25th, Michael Dunahy remained gone. The athletic field where he had disappeared stood empty in morning light, the playground equipment casting long shadows across ground that had yielded no answers. Somewhere, a 4-year-old boy who had been playing innocently the previous morning was either hidden, traveling, or something far worse. A possibility too horrific to voice but impossible to ignore. The investigation had only begun. The search would continue expanding, but the terrible truth was already becoming apparent. Michael had vanished so completely, so thoroughly, that recovering him might prove impossible. As March surrendered to April and spring deepened across British Columbia, the search for Michael Dunahy evolved from an emergency response into a sustained investigation of unprecedented scope. The Victoria Police Department, joined by Royal Canadian Mounted Police and assisted by law enforcement agencies across Canada, constructed a command structure designed to process the avalanche of information pouring in from every direction. Tips flooded telephone lines, hundreds initially, then thousands, each one requiring investigation, verification, and documentation. The investigation's geographic scope expanded rapidly beyond Victoria. Michael's photograph appeared on milk cartons, billboards, and in newspaper advertisements across Canada. America received similar saturation. Missing child organizations distributed Michael's image throughout the United States, particularly in border states where an abductor might have fled quickly. The theory that Michael could have been transported across the international border gained traction among investigators who recognized that proximity to Washington state created troubling possibilities for rapid escape. Investigators constructed detailed profiles of every adult who had been present at Blanchard Park on March 24th. Parents who had attended the athletic field gathering underwent extensive interviews. Their backgrounds received scrutiny, their relationships examined, their alibis verified. This process, while necessary, created additional trauma for families already devastated by Michael's disappearance. The reality of modern criminal investigation demands that everyone receives examination. Statistically, Children are most often harmed by those within their own circles, making it essential to eliminate familiar faces before pursuing stranger theories. The Dunahi family endured interrogation that, while professionally conducted, carried implicit accusations. Crystal's timeline received microscopic examination. Exactly how long had she been distracted? Precisely where had she been standing? What had captured her attention during those crucial seconds? Bruce Dunahi's whereabouts and activities underwent similar scrutiny. Both parents submitted to polygraph examinations, searches of their home, and interviews that probed every aspect of their lives. This process, standard in missing child investigations, added another layer of agony to parents already experiencing unimaginable suffering. Beyond the immediate family, investigators examined extended relatives, family friends, neighbors, and acquaintances. Anyone who had contact with Michael became a person of interest requiring elimination through alibi verification. The labor-intensive nature of this work consumed countless hours, yet it represented essential methodology. Child abductions frequently involve perpetrators who had legitimate access to their victims, who appeared trustworthy, who occupied positions allowing them to interact with children without raising suspicion. Registered offenders throughout British Columbia and beyond received immediate attention. Individuals with histories of crimes against children found police officers on their doorsteps, demanding alibis for March 24th, requesting consent for property searches, and monitoring their movements. This dragnet approach, while yielding no direct leads to Michael, served the dual purpose of investigation and deterrence, demonstrating to potential predators that law enforcement was watching, ready to respond to any suspicious behavior. Witness accounts from Blanchard Park, when assembled into a comprehensive timeline, revealed troubling gaps and contradictions. Human memory proves notoriously unreliable, particularly when individuals are focused on their own children rather than conducting surveillance of entire environments. Some parents recalled seeing a suspicious vehicle in the area. Descriptions varied wildly regarding make, model, and color. Others remembered observing an individual who seemed out of place, though these accounts failed to coalesce into a coherent description. A few witnesses reported seeing a man watching the playground intently, but attempts to construct a composite sketch produced results too vague for effective distribution. One particular lead generated significant investigative energy. Multiple witnesses reported observing a brown van in the vicinity of Blanchard Park around the time of Michael's disappearance. This vehicle, according to various accounts, had been driven by a man whose appearance matched no one who had legitimate reason to be present. Investigators pursued this lead aggressively, checking registration records for brown vans throughout the region, interviewing owners, examining vehicles for any evidence connecting them to Michael. Despite exhaustive efforts, the brown van lead dissipated into inconclusive dead ends. Either the witnesses had been mistaken about the vehicle's significance, or the perpetrator had successfully hidden or disposed of it. Psychological profilers joined the investigation, constructing theoretical portraits of who might abduct a 4-year-old boy from a crowded location. The profiles suggested someone familiar with the area, comfortable operating in public spaces, and possessing either remarkable confidence or severe psychological pathology, allowing them to act amid witnesses. The abductor would likely have surveilled the location previously, identifying escape routes and timing. They might live locally, allowing them to monitor police activity and adjust behavior accordingly. These profiles, while potentially accurate, described a phantom. Someone moving through society appearing normal, their darkness hidden beneath conventional facades. The investigation's technological aspects reflected early 1990s capabilities and limitations. Security cameras remained relatively uncommon, particularly in public parks and residential neighborhoods. Traffic cameras that might have captured vehicles fleeing the area were sparse. The digital revolution that would later provide investigators with cell phone records, GPS data, and electronic trails was still emerging. Investigators worked primarily with traditional methodology, interviews, physical evidence collection, and database cross-referencing that required manual effort rather than computer algorithms. Forensic specialists examined the Blanchard Park playground with meticulous attention. Every surface that might retain fingerprints received processing. Soil samples were collected and analyzed for any trace evidence. The wood chip ground covering was sifted carefully, searching for dropped items, fibers, or anything that might have been left behind during Michael's abduction. This exhaustive physical examination revealed nothing of investigative value. Either the abductor had left no physical evidence, or environmental contamination from dozens of children and parents had destroyed whatever traces might have existed. As weeks became months, the investigation confronted a harsh reality. Michael Dunahy had disappeared without leaving behind a meaningful trail. Despite thousands of tips investigated, hundreds of interviews conducted, and countless hours of police work invested, no concrete evidence emerged indicating what happened to him or who was responsible. The case wasn't cold exactly. Investigators remained actively engaged, but it had reached a frustrating stasis where effort no longer produced proportional results. The psychological toll on investigators themselves became significant. Detectives assigned to Michael's case carried photographs of the missing boy, their daily work immersed in the tragedy of his disappearance. The absence of resolution created cumulative frustration. Each false lead drained emotional reserves. The knowledge that somewhere, Michael was either being held captive or had suffered an even worse fate haunted those committed to finding him. Several investigators who worked the case extensively later spoke about the profound impact it had on their careers and personal lives. The unresolved nature of Michael's disappearance became a weight they would carry permanently. Media coverage remained intense throughout the initial months. Television programs featured Michael's case regularly. Newspapers ran updates on the investigation's progress, or lack thereof. The Dunahy family appeared on national broadcasts, making repeated emotional appeals for Michael's safe return. This sustained public attention served multiple purposes: keeping Michael's face visible, generating additional tips, and maintaining pressure on whoever had taken him. Yet media attention also carried costs, particularly for the Dunahy family whose grief played out in public view, their every statement analyzed and critiqued by strangers. The community's response evolved from immediate crisis reaction into sustained support. Fundraising efforts generated resources for investigative costs not covered by public funding. Volunteer organizations dedicated to finding Michael maintained search operations long after the initial emergency response concluded. Citizens throughout Victoria remained vigilant, believing that continued awareness might eventually produce the crucial information that would crack the case open. This collective determination reflected the profound impact Michael's disappearance had on the community, transforming a city's relationship with safety, innocence, and the vulnerability of children. Psychologists and child safety experts analyzed the case extensively, using Michael's disappearance as a tragic example of how quickly predators can strike. The 72 seconds during which Michael vanished became a reference point in discussions about child supervision and stranger danger. Parents throughout Canada and beyond reconsidered their assumptions about safety in crowded public spaces. If a child could be abducted from an athletic field surrounded by adults in broad daylight, then perhaps nowhere was truly safe. This heightened anxiety, while understandable, represented another dimension of harm: the way Michael's disappearance had altered society's collective psyche regarding childhood and vulnerability. By summer of 1991, Michael had been missing for months. His 5th birthday passed without celebration, marked instead by renewed appeals and increased investigative efforts. The season that should have been filled with outdoor play, learning experiences, and the simple joys of early childhood was instead measured in his absence. Somewhere, the reality of what had happened to Michael existed. Either he was alive, held captive by someone whose psychology allowed them to steal and conceal a child, or his remains lay hidden in a location that had evaded massive searches. Neither possibility offered comfort. As the investigation stretched across years rather than months, theories regarding Michael Dunahy's fate multiplied and evolved. Each hypothesis carried its own logic and supporting circumstances, yet none yielded the definitive evidence required for resolution. The absence of concrete information created a void that speculation eagerly filled, generating scenarios ranging from plausible to fantastical. The stranger abduction theory remained primary among investigators. Statistical analysis suggested that Michael's disappearance bore hallmarks of opportunistic predation. a child briefly unattended, grabbed quickly, and removed from the area before his absence triggered alarm. This scenario presumed a perpetrator either living locally or passing through Victoria, someone whose external appearance allowed them to move through public spaces without attracting suspicion. The rapidity of Michael's disappearance suggested either exceptional luck or prior planning. A predator who had perhaps identified Blanchard Park as a location offering opportunities, who had studied traffic patterns and escape routes, who waited for precisely the right moment to strike. Alternative theories proposed organized criminal involvement, human trafficking networks that targeted young children for exploitation. This hypothesis, while generating significant investigative attention, struggled against logistical realities. Human trafficking typically involves vulnerable populations with fewer community resources and less media attention. Michael's disappearance triggered massive law enforcement response and sustained media coverage, making him an illogical target for organized criminals seeking to operate discreetly. Nevertheless, investigators pursued this angle thoroughly, coordinating with international law enforcement agencies tracking child exploitation networks. Some investigators considered the possibility of parental abduction despite the Dunahi family having been cleared as suspects. Could an estranged relative have taken Michael? Extensive examination of family dynamics revealed no evidence supporting this theory, no custody disputes, no family members with suspicious backgrounds or concerning behavior patterns, no fractured relationships suggesting motivation for child abduction. The family theory ultimately collapsed under the weight of evidence demonstrating that Michael's parents and relatives had been devastated by his disappearance and desperate for his return. Perhaps most disturbing were theories suggesting Michael had been abducted by a serial offender, someone for whom child abduction represented not an isolated act but part of a pattern. Investigators examined unsolved cases throughout Canada and the United States, searching for similarities that might link Michael's disappearance to other crimes. Several cases bore troubling resemblances. Children vanishing from seemingly secure locations, disappearances occurring during brief moments of inattention, complete absence of physical evidence or witnesses. While these similarities generated intense investigative focus, definitive connections remained elusive. Without physical evidence linking cases, the possibility of a serial offender remained theoretical speculation rather than actionable intelligence. Specific suspects emerged periodically, each one generating renewed hope that resolution might finally be approaching. One individual who attracted significant attention was a transient who had been in Victoria during March 1991 and had previous convictions for crimes against children. This person became the focus of extensive investigation. Their movements during the relevant time frame were reconstructed meticulously. Their known associates were interviewed, and their property was searched thoroughly. Despite investigators' best efforts, no evidence emerged connecting this individual to Michael's disappearance. The suspect had alibis for portions of March 24th, and nothing in their background suggested the sophistication required to abduct a child from a crowded location and conceal them so effectively. Another suspect generated international attention when a man in the United States was arrested for attempting to abduct a different child. During interrogation, this individual made statements suggesting knowledge of Michael's case. Investigators traveled to interview him extensively, hoping he might provide information about Michael's fate. The suspect's claims proved vague and inconsistent, containing details readily available from media coverage but nothing demonstrating genuine insider knowledge. Ultimately, this lead dissolved into frustration. Either the suspect was seeking attention through false claims, or he possessed information he refused to share completely. Perhaps most cruel were the false sightings that occurred regularly throughout the years following Michael's disappearance. Parents across Canada and beyond reported seeing a child matching Michael's description. Each sighting triggered immediate investigation. Police would respond rapidly, photographs would be examined, and the child in question would be identified. Invariably, these proved to be other children bearing superficial resemblance to Michael. The Dunahi family endured repeated cycles of hope and devastation as each potential sighting ultimately led nowhere. The emotional toll of these false alarms compounded their ongoing grief, creating new wounds atop those that had never healed. Age progression photographs became an important investigative tool as years accumulated. Specialists trained in facial development created images showing how Michael might appear as he grew older, projections showing him at age 7, age 10, age 15. These images were distributed widely, posted in schools and public spaces, featured on missing children websites. The theory supporting age progression work held that while Michael as a 4-year-old had vanished, he might still be alive somewhere, growing older, perhaps not even knowing his true identity if his abductor had raised him as their own child. This possibility, while offering hope, also presented nightmare scenarios of Michael living unaware that people searched for him, that a family mourned his absence, that his entire existence had been built on lies. The investigation embraced emerging forensic technologies as they became available. DNA databases that could potentially link evidence to perpetrators were non-existent when Michael disappeared but developed rapidly through the 1990s. Investigators ensured that DNA evidence from Michael, obtained from preserved belongings, was entered into these databases, ready for comparison should any relevant samples emerge. Similarly, advances in geographic profiling and behavioral analysis were applied retrospectively to Michael's case, generating new theories about where his abductor might have lived and what characteristics they likely possessed. Anonymous tips continued flowing in even years after Michael's disappearance. Some came from individuals claiming psychic abilities who saw Michael in various locations or circumstances. While investigators maintained professional skepticism regarding psychic claims, they nevertheless followed up on specific details provided, hoping that occasionally genuine information might be wrapped in pseudoscientific explanations. Other tips came from people reporting suspicious neighbors, family members whose behavior concerned them, or confessions heard secondhand. Each tip required resources to investigate properly, consuming countless hours of detective work that rarely produced meaningful results. The financial costs of the investigation were substantial. Police departments allocated significant budgets to maintaining Michael's case as an active investigation. Volunteer organizations dedicated to finding Michael raised and spent considerable sums on search operations, awareness campaigns, and support for the Dunahi family. The economic impact extended beyond direct investigation costs. The case generated demand for child safety products, educational programs about stranger danger, and consultancy services claiming expertise in child protection. Michael's disappearance had become not merely a personal tragedy and law enforcement challenge, but an economic ecosystem unto itself. Media coverage evolved as the case aged. Initial news reports focused on search efforts and investigative updates. As years passed without resolution, coverage shifted toward anniversary pieces. Each March 24th brought renewed attention, interviews with the Dunahi family, and retrospective analysis of the case. True crime television programs featured Michael's disappearance extensively, often presenting dramatizations of his abduction and examining various theories regarding his fate. This sustained media presence served the practical purpose of keeping Michael's face visible while simultaneously transforming his disappearance into a cultural touchstone representing every parent's worst nightmare. The Dunahi family's experience during these years defied comprehension. They existed in a state of permanent suspension, unable to grieve fully because certainty regarding Michael's fate remained absent, unable to move forward because hope, however microscopic, persisted. They became public figures despite never seeking such status. Their privacy surrendered to the demands of keeping Michael's case visible. They attended vigils, gave interviews, met with politicians advocating for improved child safety measures, and maintained a public face while privately experiencing anguish that only those who have lost children can truly understand. Other families whose children had disappeared connected with the Dunahis, forming support networks built on shared trauma. These relationships provided some comfort, the knowledge that others understood what it meant to live with ambiguity, to experience hope and despair in rapid cycles, to endure insensitive questions and public speculation. Yet these connections also reinforced the terrible reality that child abduction, while statistically rare, occurred with sufficient frequency to create entire communities of bereaved families searching desperately for missing sons and daughters. Legislative changes emerged partially in response to Michael's case. Canadian authorities implemented improved systems for rapid response to child abduction reports, recognizing that the crucial early hours required coordinated, immediate action. Amber Alert systems, which broadcast information about abducted children through various media channels, developed partially from lessons learned in cases like Michael's. While these improvements wouldn't help Michael directly, they represented society's attempt to prevent future tragedies and improve recovery chances for other missing children. As the 20th century surrendered to the 21st, Michael Dunahy's disappearance transitioned from recent tragedy to historical mystery. He would have celebrated his 18th birthday in 1998, his 21st in 2001, his 30th in 2010. Each milestone arrived wrapped in speculation. Where was Michael now? If he still lived? Did he remember his birth family? Or had those memories been supplanted by whatever existence his abductor had constructed? The questions multiplied with time rather than diminishing. The investigation remained technically active, though practical reality meant that unless new evidence emerged, detectives could do little beyond maintaining files and following up on occasional tips. The original investigators who had worked Michael's case intensively had retired or moved to other assignments. New detectives inheriting the case approached it with fresh perspectives but faced the same frustrating absence of solid evidence that had stymied their predecessors. Cold case units periodically reviewed all accumulated information, applying modern analytical techniques to decades-old data, hoping that something might have been missed initially or that new forensic capabilities might extract meaning from evidence that had yielded nothing previously. DNA technology advanced dramatically during the decades following Michael's disappearance, offering new possibilities for resolution. Investigators maintained genetic profiles derived from Michael's belongings, ready for comparison against any relevant samples. The expansion of DNA databases, both criminal databases containing profiles from convicted offenders and genealogical databases built from consumer genetic testing services, created unprecedented opportunities for connecting evidence to individuals. If Michael's abductor had committed other crimes resulting in DNA collection, or if relatives of the perpetrator had submitted genetic material to genealogical services, potential connections might be identified. Yet these possibilities required evidence to analyze. Without physical items from the abduction scene or without Michael's remains being discovered, DNA technology remained a powerful tool with nothing to apply itself toward. Periodically, remains of unidentified children were discovered in various locations throughout Canada and the United States. Each discovery triggered analysis to determine whether the remains might be Michael's. Forensic anthropologists would examine bones, estimating age, stature, and timing of death. Dental records and DNA analysis would be employed when possible. The Dunahy family endured repeated notifications that remains had been found, followed eventually by confirmation that the deceased child was someone else. Another family's tragedy, another unresolved case, but not Michael. These episodes represented fresh trauma each time, reopening wounds that never truly healed. The internet's rise created new dimensions for both investigation and suffering. Missing children cases that previously relied on physical posters and local media coverage could now reach global audiences instantly. Michael's photographs circulated through websites dedicated to missing persons, shared across social media platforms, and featured in online databases accessible worldwide. This expanded visibility generated additional tips from international sources but also attracted conspiracy theorists and online sleuths whose speculative investigations sometimes interfered with legitimate law enforcement efforts. True crime culture flourished in the digital age, with Michael's case featuring prominently in podcasts, YouTube documentaries, and online discussion forums. Amateur investigators dissected every known detail, proposing elaborate theories and conducting independent research. While some of these efforts were conducted respectfully and occasionally even generated useful information, others crossed ethical boundaries, harassing individuals baselessly accused of involvement, spreading unsubstantiated rumors, and treating real tragedy as entertainment. The Dunahy family found themselves navigating a landscape where their most painful experience was dissected endlessly by strangers who had never known Michael but felt entitled to speculate about his fate. Psychological research examining trauma experienced by families of missing children identified unique challenges that distinguished this grief from bereavement following confirmed death. The absence of closure creates what psychologists term ambiguous loss. a condition where the inability to confirm whether a loved one is alive or dead prevents normal grieving processes. The Dunahi family exemplified this phenomenon, existing in a state of suspended animation where hope and despair coexisted perpetually. They couldn't grieve Michael as dead, yet they couldn't live normally while his fate remained unknown. This psychological torture extended across decades, affecting not only immediate family members but also extended relatives, friends, and the broader community that had rallied around Michael's case. The geographic location where Michael's abduction occurred became something of a memorial site. Blanchard Park continued functioning as a public space, with children playing on equipment similar to what had been present in 1991. Yet those familiar with Michael's case could never view the location without remembering what had happened there. The very ordinariness of the park amplified the horror. This wasn't a remote, dangerous location, but rather a community gathering space where families should feel safe. Plaques and memorial markers placed near the area where Michael disappeared served as permanent reminders of how quickly innocence can be shattered and how thoroughly a person can vanish. Advances in surveillance technology created somewhat safer environments for children in subsequent decades, though at the cost of privacy and with the troubling acknowledgement that these protections came too late for Michael and others like him. Public spaces installed security cameras. Parents began using GPS tracking devices to monitor children's locations. Schools implemented stricter protocols regarding child supervision and visitor access. These measures represented society's response to tragedies like Michael's disappearance, attempts to prevent future abductions even as past cases remained unsolved. The question of whether Michael Dunahi is still alive has haunted speculation since his disappearance. If he survived the initial abduction, where might he be now? Some theories proposed that he had been taken to raise as another family's child, perhaps by someone unable to have children through legitimate means, or someone whose mental illness drove them to abduct rather than adopt. This scenario suggested Michael might be living under another identity, possibly unaware of his true origins, potentially having lived an otherwise normal existence except for the fundamental lie at its foundation. If this were true, DNA testing or a chance encounter might eventually reveal his identity. Other theories suggested darker fates, that Michael had been taken for exploitation purposes and might have survived years of abuse before either escaping or aging out of whatever sick interest had motivated his abduction. The most pessimistic assessments presumed Michael had been murdered shortly after his abduction, his remains concealed in a location that had evaded extensive searches. The perpetrator's fate has been equally speculative. Did Michael's abductor continue living in Victoria, perhaps even participating in searches and memorial activities while hiding their guilt? Did they flee to another region or country, evading justice through geographic distance? Have they committed additional crimes, perhaps abducting other children? Or did Michael represent an isolated act that they somehow never repeated? Another grim possibility suggests that whoever took Michael might themselves be deceased, having died from natural causes, accident, or even suicide, taking knowledge of Michael's fate to the grave. This scenario would explain why the case has never been solved despite extensive investigation. The perpetrator's death would have removed the only person capable of providing answers. In 2011, the 20th anniversary of Michael's disappearance prompted renewed investigative efforts. Detectives conducted fresh interviews with individuals who had been present at Blanchard Park that morning, hoping that 2 decades might have loosened memories or encouraged witnesses previously reluctant to speak. Age-progressed photographs showing Michael as he would appear at 24 years old circulated widely. Media coverage brought the case back into public consciousness, generating thousands of new tips that required investigation. Despite these intensive efforts, no breakthrough emerged. The 20th anniversary served primarily as a reminder that 2 decades had passed without resolution, without justice, without answers. The Dunahi family has maintained advocacy efforts throughout the decades, channeling their grief into action intended to help other families. They have spoken at events promoting child safety, supported legislative initiatives improving response to missing children cases, and worked with organizations dedicated to locating abducted children. This activism represents their refusal to allow Michael's disappearance to be meaningless. If Michael himself couldn't be found, perhaps their efforts might help return other missing children to their families or prevent additional tragedies. The courage required to transform personal devastation into public service deserves recognition, even as it underscores the impossibility of any action truly compensating for Michael's absence. As we approach the case's 34th anniversary, Michael Dunahy would be 38 years old if he survived. He could be a father himself, raising children who would be grandchildren the Dunahy family has never met. He might possess career achievements, personal relationships, and a full life, all built unknowingly on stolen identity if he was raised by his abductor and remains unaware of his origins. Alternatively, his story might have ended in childhood, his potential extinguished by whoever took him from Blanchard Park that spring morning. The uncertainty persists, as painful now as it was decades ago. The investigation into Michael Dunahy's disappearance remains technically open. Tips continue arriving periodically, each one recorded and investigated according to established protocols. Should new evidence emerge, remains discovered, a DNA match identified, a confession obtained, the case could theoretically be resolved even after all these years. Yet practical reality suggests that without such dramatic developments, the mystery of what happened to Michael Dunahy will persist indefinitely. The passage of time works against resolution as memories fade, witnesses die, and physical evidence deteriorates. The broader impact of Michael's disappearance extends far beyond his immediate family. His case transformed Canadian society's understanding of child safety, contributing to cultural shifts regarding supervision, stranger danger, and parental vigilance. The fear that a child could vanish in 72 seconds from a crowded, supervised location fundamentally altered how parents approach public spaces. This heightened anxiety, while perhaps promoting greater caution, also represents a loss of innocence, an erosion of the belief that communities could inherently protect their most vulnerable members. Michael Dunahy's legacy exists in multiple forms. For his family, he remains forever 4 years old, frozen in memory as the bright-eyed boy who disappeared before his life could truly unfold. For investigators, he represents unfinished business, a case that should have been solvable but somehow wasn't. For the community that rallied around his disappearance, he symbolizes both collective determination and the limits of what even coordinated effort can achieve. For society broadly, he stands as a reminder that evil exists, that predators move among us appearing normal, and that the safety we assume for our children is more fragile than we want to believe. The ultimate truth about what happened to Michael Dunahy rests with very few individuals. The perpetrator certainly, possibly Michael himself if he survived, perhaps a small number of others depending on circumstances. The rest of us are left with absence, questions, and the haunting reality that 72 seconds were sufficient to erase a child from existence so thoroughly that decades of searching could not reveal his fate. We are left with the image of a 4-year-old boy in a blue sweatshirt, blonde hair catching sunlight, moving toward playground equipment and then simply ceasing to be. We are left with a family permanently fractured, a community forever changed, and a mystery that may never be solved. Somewhere, answers exist. Somewhere, the truth about Michael Dunahy's disappearance waits to be discovered. Whether that truth will ever emerge from the shadows remains unknown. Until it does, Michael's case endures as one of Canada's most haunting unsolved mysteries, a testament to how completely a person can vanish, how thoroughly evil can conceal itself, and how desperately we search for answers even when none appear forthcoming. The playground at Blanchard Park remains, children still play there, but those who remember March 24th, 1991 can never view that space without seeing a small boy who should still be there but isn't, and never will be again. If you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your part of the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to like this video and subscribe, so you never miss the next true crime story to help you unwind. Now, let's get into our final story. Story 4. The Angel of Death, Charles Cullen's 16-year reign of hospital terror. In the sterile corridors where healing was promised and lives were supposed to be saved, one nurse spent 16 years transforming bedside care into calculated execution, injecting death into the veins of those who trusted him most. Between 1988 and 2003, Charles Cullen didn't just break the Hippocratic Oath. He shattered it across 9 medical facilities in 2 states, administering lethal doses of medications to as many as 400 unsuspecting patients, making him potentially the most prolific serial killer in American history. This registered nurse, sworn to protect life, instead became a silent predator stalking hospital wards under the cover of professional authority, wielding syringes filled with digoxin, insulin, and epinephrine like weapons of mass destruction. While families sat in waiting rooms praying for recovery, while doctors wrote orders expecting compliance, while administrators collected insurance payments assuming quality care, Cullen moved from room to room in the dead of night, selecting victims with chilling randomness and ending lives with substances that mimicked natural medical decline. His method was insidious, his access absolute, his detection nearly impossible, because who suspects the healer of being the executioner? This is the disturbing chronicle of how one man exploited the sacred trust between caregiver and patient, how institutional failures allowed carnage to continue for nearly 2 decades, and how the very system designed to save lives became an accomplice to mass murder. Charles Edmund Cullen entered this world on February 22, 1960, in West Orange, New Jersey, the youngest of 8 children born into a family that would soon be fractured by tragedy and dysfunction. Before his first birthday, his father died, leaving his mother to raise the children alone in circumstances marked by instability and emotional turbulence. The household became a pressure cooker of psychological strain, with young Charles developing patterns of behavior that would later reveal themselves as warning signs ignored by everyone around him. His childhood was punctuated by loss and mental anguish that manifested in disturbing ways. At merely 9 years old, Cullen made his first documented suicide attempt, a horrifying indicator of the darkness already consuming his young mind. This wasn't a cry for attention in the traditional sense. It was the beginning of a pattern that would repeat throughout his life with terrifying regularity. By the time he reached adolescence, he had attempted to take his own life multiple times, ingesting chemicals, medications, and engaging in self-destructive behaviors that should have triggered intensive psychiatric intervention. The death of his mother when Cullen was 17 proved to be another devastating blow to his already fragmented psyche. Rather than seeking healthy outlets for his grief and anger, he internalized the pain, allowing it to ferment into something far more sinister. His isolation deepened, his mental state deteriorated, and the boundary between his own mortality and that of others began to blur in ways that would prove catastrophic for hundreds of innocent people. After graduating from high school in 1978, Cullen enlisted in the United States Navy, where he served aboard the submarine USS Woodrow Wilson. Even in this structured military environment, his psychological instability couldn't be contained. He made multiple suicide attempts during his service, behaviors so concerning that the Navy eventually discharged him in 1984. The military's psychological evaluations documented severe depression and suicidal ideation, yet these records would somehow fail to prevent him from entering one of the most trust-dependent professions imaginable. Following his naval discharge, Cullen enrolled in nursing school, graduating from the Mountainside Hospital School of Nursing in Montclair, New Jersey, in 1987. One must pause to consider the catastrophic failure of vetting that allowed someone with such a documented history of mental instability and self-harm to enter the medical profession. The gatekeepers of healthcare credentialing somehow missed or ignored the red flags waving frantically in his background, granting him access to the most vulnerable population conceivable, hospitalized patients too sick to defend themselves. In 1988, Charles Cullen began his nursing career at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey, working in the cardiac care unit. To his colleagues, he appeared quiet, competent, and dedicated, perhaps too dedicated, often volunteering for additional shifts and showing up on his days off. What they interpreted as admirable work ethic was actually the compulsion of a predator establishing hunting grounds. Within the first year of his employment, patients in his care began dying unexpectedly, their hearts stopping without clear medical explanation, their bodies shutting down in ways that puzzled even experienced physicians. The medications Cullen selected for his executions revealed a sophisticated understanding of pharmacology and its lethal applications. Digoxin, a cardiac medication used to treat heart failure and irregular rhythms, became one of his preferred instruments of death. In therapeutic doses, digoxin strengthens the heart's contractions and regulates its rhythm, but in excessive amounts, it causes the heart to beat erratically before stopping altogether. The brilliance of Cullen's method lay in its mimicry of natural cardiac events. Elderly patients with existing heart conditions dying of apparent heart failure raised few suspicions in a cardiac unit where death was not uncommon. Insulin was another weapon in his pharmaceutical arsenal, a hormone that regulates blood sugar but becomes deadly when administered to non-diabetic patients or given in massive doses to diabetics. Cullen would access insulin supplies and inject them directly into intravenous lines or medication bags, sending patients into hypoglycemic shock that caused confusion, seizures, loss of consciousness, and ultimately death. The symptoms could be mistaken for diabetic complications or stroke, especially in elderly patients with complex medical histories. Epinephrine, typically used to restart hearts during cardiac arrest or treat severe allergic reactions, became a tool for inducing the very crises it was meant to reverse. In the wrong dose or given to a stable patient, epinephrine causes dangerous spikes in heart rate and blood pressure, precipitating heart attacks, strokes, and fatal arrhythmias. Cullen understood precisely how to weaponize these life-saving medications, transforming healing agents into instruments of murder. His first confirmed victim, though the true first may never be known, was Judge John W. Yengo Sr. at St. Barnabas Medical Center in 1988. The elderly judge had been recovering from cardiac surgery when Cullen administered a lethal dose of intravenous medication. The death was attributed to complications from surgery, and no investigation followed. This successful evasion of detection established a pattern that would repeat with horrifying frequency. Cullen would kill, the death would be attributed to natural causes or expected decline, and he would move on to select his next victim. The psychological profile of Charles Cullen presents a disturbing puzzle that forensic psychiatrists have attempted to decode. Unlike many serial killers who derive sexual gratification or experience a power rush from their murders, Cullen's motivations appeared more complex and disturbing in their ambiguity. In later interviews, he would claim he was mercy-killing patients to end their suffering. Yet his victim selection contradicted this assertion. He murdered patients who were recovering, patients with good prognosis, patients whose families were planning their homecoming. The randomness of his selections suggested something darker than misguided compassion. Some experts theorized that Cullen's repeated suicide attempts reflected a death wish he eventually projected onto others, making them surrogates for his own desire for non-existence. Others suggest he experienced a pathological need for control in an environment where he otherwise felt powerless and insignificant. By determining who lived and who died, he became a god in the hospital ward, wielding ultimate power over human existence. The quiet, submissive nurse who took orders from doctors and supervisors all day could, in the privacy of a patient's room at 3 a.m, become the supreme arbiter of life and death. His personal life during these early killing years reflected the chaos of his internal world. Cullen married in 1987, and the couple had 2 daughters, but the marriage was turbulent and marked by his continuing mental health crises. His wife would later describe living in constant fear of his suicidal behaviors and erratic moods, never imagining that the darkness she witnessed at home was spilling over into his professional life in the most horrific way possible. They divorced in 1993, but by then, Cullen's body count had been climbing steadily for 5 years. Between 1988 and 1992, while working at St. Barnabas, Cullen is believed to have murdered numerous patients, though exact numbers remain speculative due to the difficulty of proving historical cases. What is known is that unexplained deaths occurred with suspicious frequency in units where he worked, patterns that should have triggered investigation but somehow didn't. The culture of medical facilities at that time rarely questioned the competence or intentions of licensed nurses, especially those who seemed dedicated and hardworking. The pattern that would characterize Charles Cullen's entire murderous career began to crystallize during his years at St. Barnabas Medical Center. Questions would be raised, concerns would be whispered in break rooms, and then he would simply resign and move to another facility, his lethal skills transported to a fresh hunting ground where no one knew the body count he left behind. This institutional game of Pass the Predator would enable his killing spree to continue for over a decade, with each hospital more concerned about potential lawsuits than stopping a serial killer in scrubs. In 1992, after 4 years at St. Barnabas, during which at least a dozen suspicious deaths occurred in his units, Cullen's access to the medication dispensing system came under scrutiny. Pharmacy audits revealed he had been withdrawing medications for patients not assigned to him, accessing drug supplies during shifts when he shouldn't have been working, and ordering quantities of cardiac medications that far exceeded any legitimate therapeutic need. Rather than reporting these findings to law enforcement or medical licensing boards, St. Barnabas allowed Cullen to resign quietly, providing neutral employment references that concealed the deadly truth. This catastrophic failure of institutional responsibility would be repeated at facility after facility. Hospitals feared the legal and financial ramifications of admitting a serial killer had operated within their walls. The potential lawsuits from victims' families, the loss of public trust, the scrutiny from regulatory agencies, and the impact on their reputations seemed more threatening to administrators than the certainty that Cullen would kill again elsewhere. So they took the coward's path, protecting their institutions while sacrificing unknown future victims to a predator they knew was dangerous. Cullen's next position was at Warren Hospital in Phillipsburg, New Jersey, where he worked from 1992 to 1993. The killings continued without interruption, as if the change of location merely provided him with a refreshed supply of potential victims. During his brief tenure at Warren, at least 3 patients died under circumstances that alarmed nurses who worked alongside him, but when concerns were raised, they were dismissed by supervisors who found Cullen's explanations plausible and saw no reason to suspect a fellow medical professional of intentional harm. One of the murders during this period involved an elderly woman recovering from routine surgery. Her condition had been stable, her prognosis excellent, and her family had been told she would be discharged within days. Cullen entered her room during the night shift, accessed her intravenous line, and injected a massive dose of digoxin directly into her bloodstream. Within minutes, her heart began beating irregularly, alarms sounded, and despite the code team's aggressive intervention, she died on the table. The death was attributed to an unexpected cardiac event, a tragic but not unheard of complication in elderly surgical patients. Her family grieved, never knowing their loved one had been murdered by the very person responsible for her care. After less than a year at Warren Hospital, Cullen resigned under circumstances that remain murky but likely involved more questions about his medication access patterns. He immediately found employment at Hunterdon Medical Center in Flemington, New Jersey, where he worked from 1993 to 1994. The ease with which he moved between facilities, despite legitimate concerns at previous employers, reveals the broken system that enabled his crimes. Background checks were perfunctory, references were accepted at face value, and no centralized database tracked problematic healthcare workers. At Hunterdon, Cullen's killing accelerated in both frequency and boldness. He murdered at least 5 patients during his brief employment there, including a cancer patient whose death was so unexpected and sudden that an autopsy was performed. The autopsy revealed lethal levels of digoxin in the patient's system, far exceeding any prescribed amount, but instead of triggering a criminal investigation, the finding was attributed to a medication error. Cullen was questioned, denied any wrongdoing, and the matter was quietly dropped. The cancer patient's family was told their loved one died from complications of the disease, and Cullen continued working, selecting his next victims with impunity. The psychological toll of maintaining his double life, devoted father to his daughters, helpful colleague to his co-workers, and prolific serial killer to his victims, manifested in continued suicide attempts and increasingly erratic behavior. In 1994, while still employed at Hunterdon, Cullen lit charcoal grills inside his home in an apparent suicide attempt that nearly killed him through carbon monoxide poisoning. When this attempt failed, he checked himself into a psychiatric facility for treatment of depression and suicidal ideation. One would reasonably expect that a critical care nurse being treated for severe mental illness and active suicidality would face scrutiny from his employer and possibly suspension of his license, but the stigma and legal protections surrounding mental health issues, combined with a shortage of qualified nurses, meant that Cullen returned to work after his psychiatric hospitalization with full access to vulnerable patients and lethal medications. The failure to connect his mental instability with the pattern of deaths in his units represents one of the most egregious oversights in this entire tragedy. From 1994 to 1996, Cullen worked at Morristown Memorial Hospital in New Jersey, where his confirmed body count reached at least 11 victims, though the true number is likely much higher. During this period, his method became more refined and his victim selection more varied. He murdered young and old, recovering and critical, those with families constantly at their bedside and those who lay alone in private rooms. The randomness of his selections frustrated later investigators trying to identify a pattern or motive, but perhaps the randomness itself was the pattern. Cullen killed because he could, because it gave him a sense of control, because the act of ending life temporarily filled whatever void existed in his psyche. One particularly haunting case from Morristown involved a man in his 40s recovering from a minor heart procedure. He had been joking with nurses earlier in the day, had eaten dinner with his wife, and had made plans for his discharge the following morning. That night, Cullen accessed his room, injected a lethal combination of medications into his foreline, and left him to die alone in the darkness. When the morning nurse found him unresponsive, a code was called, but resuscitation efforts failed. His wife, who had gone home to get rest before his planned discharge, received a phone call that her healthy husband had inexplicably died during the night. She would spend years believing it was a tragic medical misfortune, never knowing it was calculated murder. Pharmacy records from Morristown would later reveal that Cullen had accessed medications for patients not under his care on at least 40 occasions, withdrawing quantities of digoxin, insulin, and epinephrine that had no legitimate therapeutic justification. Computer logs showed him accessing the medication dispensing system at odd hours, sometimes when he wasn't even scheduled to be working. These red flags, which should have triggered immediate investigation, were either overlooked or rationalized away by supervisors who couldn't conceive that a nurse might be deliberately harming patients. In 1996, concerns about medication irregularities finally led to Cullen's resignation from Morristown Memorial Hospital, but once again, no report was made to law enforcement or licensing authorities. He simply moved on to Liberty Nursing and Rehabilitation Center in Allentown, Pennsylvania, crossing state lines to access a new population of vulnerable victims. The failure of New Jersey hospitals to report their suspicions to Pennsylvania authorities meant that Cullen arrived with a clean slate, his past erased, his future victims unprotected. Liberty Nursing and Rehabilitation Center became Charles Cullen's next killing field, a long-term care facility housing elderly residents with chronic conditions who depended entirely on their caregivers for survival. The vulnerability of nursing home residents made them perfect targets for Cullen's lethal administrations. They were often confused or unable to communicate effectively. They had multiple medical problems that could explain sudden declines, and their deaths, while sad, were expected given their age and conditions. This environment of expected mortality provided Cullen with perfect camouflage for murder. During his 1996 to 1998 tenure at Liberty, Cullen is believed to have murdered at least 13 residents, though the actual number could be significantly higher. Long-term care facilities at that time had even less rigorous medication tracking systems than hospitals, making it easier for Cullen to access lethal drugs without detection. He would retrieve insulin meant for diabetic residents and inject it into non-diabetic patients, causing sudden drops in blood sugar that led to seizures, coma, and death. The deaths would be attributed to stroke or other age-related conditions, and families would be told their loved ones passed peacefully in their sleep. One victim at Liberty was an elderly woman with dementia who had been living at the facility for several years. Though her memory was failing, she was physically healthy and her family visited regularly. Cullen entered her room one evening and administered a massive dose of insulin through her feeding tube. Within hours, she became unresponsive, her blood sugar dropping to dangerously low levels. By the time staff discovered her condition and attempted to correct it with glucose, the damage to her brain was catastrophic. She died 2 days later, with the cause listed as complications from dementia, and her family never suspected that her death was anything but natural decline. The psychological compartmentalization required for Cullen to function as both caregiver and killer during this period is difficult to fathom. He would assist residents with bathing, feeding, and medication during his regular duties, presenting himself as gentle and compassionate, only to return later and inject death into their veins. Co-workers described him as quiet and dedicated, someone who genuinely seemed to care about the residents, making the reality of his actions all the more disturbing. The mask he wore was so convincing that even those who worked beside him daily never suspected the monster hidden beneath the facade of professionalism. After leaving Liberty in 1998, Cullen worked briefly at Easton Hospital in Pennsylvania, where at least one suspicious death occurred during his short employment. He then moved to Lehigh Valley Hospital in Allentown, where he worked in the cardiac care unit from 1998 to 2002. This facility would become the site of some of his most prolific killing, with at least 29 confirmed murders during his tenure, though investigators believe the actual number exceeds 50. At Lehigh Valley, Cullen's access to sophisticated cardiac medications and his assignment to critically ill patients created the perfect storm for mass murder. He administered lethal doses of digoxin with such frequency that the hospital pharmacy began running out of the medication, forcing them to order supplies more frequently than any previous period. This massive increase in digoxin consumption should have triggered immediate investigation, but the pharmacy department attributed it to an increase in patients requiring the medication rather than considering the possibility of diversion or intentional misuse. The victims at Lehigh Valley ranged from elderly cardiac patients to middle-aged individuals recovering from routine procedures. Stella Danielczyk, a 72-year-old woman being treated for an irregular heartbeat, became one of Cullen's confirmed victims in 2001. Her condition had been improving, and doctors anticipated her discharge within days. Cullen accessed the medication room, withdrew multiple doses of digoxin, and injected them into her 4-bag. Within hours, she developed severe cardiac arrhythmias, her heart beating wildly as the toxic levels of medication coursed through her system. Despite aggressive intervention by the code team, she died in the intensive care unit, leaving her family devastated and confused by the sudden deterioration. Another victim, Ottomar Schramm, an 80-year-old Korean war veteran, was recovering from pneumonia when Cullen murdered him with digoxin injections in 1999. Schramm's death was particularly cruel because he had been improving steadily, making plans with his family for his return home. On his final night, Cullen entered his room and administered a lethal dose that stopped his heart within hours. His family was told he had suffered an unexpected cardiac event related to his age and weakened condition, and they mourned believing death had come naturally. The sheer volume of deaths in cardiac care units where Cullen worked began raising concerns among some nursing staff who noticed patterns they couldn't explain. Patients who had been stable would suddenly deteriorate on Cullen's shifts, always from cardiac events that seemed to come out of nowhere. Several nurses voiced concerns to supervisors, noting that the death rate in their unit had increased significantly since Cullen's arrival, but their warnings were dismissed as coincidence or attributed to an influx of sicker patients. One particularly observant nurse kept informal notes tracking deaths in relation to Cullen's work schedule and found a correlation that disturbed her deeply. She brought her concerns to hospital administration, presenting data showing that patients died at significantly higher rates when Cullen was working than when he wasn't. The administration thanked her for the information but took no action, later claiming they found her evidence circumstantial and didn't want to accuse a nurse without definitive proof. This failure to investigate aggressively would allow Cullen to continue killing for 2 more years. During his time at Lehigh Valley, Cullen's personal life continued its downward spiral. He was arrested for trespassing when found in a former girlfriend's home uninvited, faced stalking allegations, and made multiple suicide attempts that resulted in psychiatric hospitalizations. Each time he was released from psychiatric care, he returned to work with full access to medications and vulnerable patients. The disconnect between his documented mental instability and his continued employment in a position of trust remains one of the most troubling aspects of this case. In 2002, after a particularly suspicious series of deaths and renewed concerns from nursing staff, Lehigh Valley Hospital administrators finally contacted law enforcement, but rather than launching a full investigation, they allowed Cullen to resign. Once again, he was permitted to walk away from dozens of murders without facing consequences, free to seek employment elsewhere. The hospital's primary concern seemed to be avoiding scandal rather than ensuring a killer faced justice, a pattern of institutional cowardice that had enabled Cullen's spree for 14 years. Somerset Medical Center in Somerville, New Jersey, became both Charles Cullen's final hunting ground and the place where his 16-year reign of terror would finally end. He began working in the critical care unit in September 2002, and within weeks, patients were dying under the same suspicious circumstances that had marked his entire career. But this time, one determined nurse and several vigilant investigators would refuse to look away from the mounting evidence. Cullen wasted no time resuming his killing at Somerset. His first confirmed victim at the facility was Reverend Florian Gall, a 68-year-old priest who had been admitted for a relatively minor cardiac issue. His prognosis was good, and he was expected to recover fully. On October 31, 2002, Cullen accessed the medication system, withdrew digoxin not prescribed for the Reverend, and injected it into his foreline. Gall's condition deteriorated rapidly, his heart rhythm becoming dangerously irregular as the toxic medication flooded his system. Despite emergency interventions, he died later that day, leaving his congregation and family devastated. Less than a month later, Cullen murdered Jean Kyung-han, a 40-year-old woman being treated for stomach cancer. She had been responding well to treatment and maintaining a positive outlook despite her diagnosis. On November 23rd, Cullen accessed her room and administered a lethal dose of digoxin. Her heart stopped suddenly, and though the medical team fought to revive her, the massive overdose had caused irreversible damage. She died leaving behind a husband and young children who couldn't comprehend how a woman who had been fighting so hard for life had suddenly lost it. The deaths continued with horrifying frequency. Giacomo Toto, a 75-year-old patient recovering from heart surgery, died on December 11, 2002, after Cullen injected him with unauthorized medications. Edward O'Toole, another cardiac patient showing steady improvement, died on December 22 following similar unauthorized medication administration. Each death was attributed to complications from existing conditions, but the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Amy Luffren, a nurse working alongside Cullen in the critical care unit, began noticing disturbing patterns. Patients assigned to Cullen's care died at disproportionate rates compared to other nurses' patients. She observed him accessing medication rooms at unusual times, appearing in patient rooms when those patients weren't assigned to him, and displaying a disturbing calmness when patients under his care suddenly crashed. Unlike administrators at previous facilities, Luffren trusted her instincts and brought her concerns to hospital leadership with compelling specificity. Somerset Medical Center's administration, possibly motivated by awareness of litigation at other facilities involving Cullen, or simply taking the concerns more seriously than previous employers had, contacted the New Jersey Poison Control Center and requested a review of recent unexpected patient deaths. The review revealed alarmingly elevated digoxin levels in several deceased patients who had not been prescribed the medication, pointing unmistakably toward intentional poisoning. The hospital also contacted the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office, finally bringing law enforcement into an investigation that should have begun years earlier. Detectives began examining pharmacy records, computer access logs, and patient charts, building a case that revealed Cullen's systematic access to medications for patients not under his care. The evidence was overwhelming. He had overridden safety protocols hundreds of times, withdrawing cardiac medications, insulin, and other drugs with no legitimate therapeutic purpose. On December 12, 2003, more than 15 years after his first confirmed murder, Charles Cullen was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. The investigation that followed would uncover the staggering scope of his crimes and reveal the catastrophic institutional failures that had allowed them to continue for so long. During interrogation, Cullen initially denied everything, maintaining the facade of innocent nurse wrongly accused. But as investigators presented the mountain of pharmaceutical evidence, computer records, and witness statements, his defenses began crumbling. He eventually admitted to murdering patients, though his confessed numbers were lower than what evidence suggested. He claimed to have killed approximately 40 patients, motivated by a desire to end their suffering, but investigators determined the actual body count was likely between 300 and 400 victims, making him potentially the most prolific serial killer in American history. The medications Cullen confessed to using included digoxin, insulin, epinephrine, and various other cardiac and respiratory drugs. His method typically involved accessing the medication dispensing system late at night, withdrawing drugs not prescribed for patients, and injecting them directly into 4-lines or medication bags. The deaths would occur hours later, after Cullen had left the floor, creating temporal distance between his actions and their fatal consequences. What emerged from his confession and the subsequent investigation was a portrait of institutional failure so comprehensive it defied comprehension. At least 6 hospitals and 1 nursing home had suspected Cullen of suspicious activity related to patient deaths or medication irregularities, yet none had reported him to law enforcement or licensing authorities. They had allowed him to resign and move on, prioritizing their institutional reputations over public safety and enabling a serial killer to continue practicing nursing. The investigation revealed that Cullen had been fired or forced to resign from at least 7 healthcare facilities under suspicious circumstances, yet he had no trouble finding new employment. Background checks failed to uncover the pattern of suspicion following him from facility to facility because hospitals hadn't documented their concerns in any centralized system. The broken mechanisms meant to protect patients instead protected a murderer. In April 2004, Charles Cullen pleaded guilty to murdering 13 patients and attempting to murder 2 others in New Jersey. He accepted the plea agreement to avoid the death penalty, receiving 11 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. Several months later, he pleaded guilty to murdering 3 patients in Pennsylvania and attempting to murder 1 other, receiving an additional 3 life sentences. In total, his confirmed victim count reached 17, though he was suspected in hundreds of additional deaths. The families of Cullen's victims were left devastated not only by their losses but by the knowledge that those deaths had been preventable. If any of the hospitals where Cullen had worked had reported their suspicions to authorities, if licensing boards had investigated the pattern of problems following him, if the system had functioned as designed, the majority of his victims would have lived. Instead, institutional cowardice and systematic failure had given a serial killer 16 years of unfettered access to vulnerable patients. Somerset Medical Center, Lehigh Valley Hospital, and several other facilities faced lawsuits from victims' families, many of which settled for undisclosed amounts. The litigation revealed the extent to which healthcare administrators had prioritized protecting their institutions over protecting patients, choosing to quietly move a problematic employee along rather than face the difficult truth that a murderer had operated within their walls. The case prompted significant reforms in healthcare oversight, including the creation of databases to track healthcare workers suspected of harming patients, more rigorous credentialing processes, and requirements that facilities report suspected criminal activity to authorities. New Jersey passed legislation mandating that healthcare facilities report any reasonable suspicion of patient harm by employees to law enforcement and licensing boards, closing the loophole that had allowed Cullen to move between facilities undetected. Charles Cullen remains incarcerated in New Jersey State Prison, where he will spend the rest of his life. In rare interviews, he has expressed what he claims is remorse for his actions, though his statements have been contradictory and self-serving. He has alternately claimed he was mercy-killing suffering patients, that he was trying to get caught by making the deaths obvious, and that he doesn't know why he killed. These shifting narratives suggest a continued unwillingness or inability to confront the truth of what he did and why. The investigation into Cullen's full victim count continues, with authorities reviewing thousands of patient deaths at the facilities where he worked. The challenge lies in proving historical cases where bodies have been cremated, medical records are incomplete, and time has eroded evidence. Many families will never know with certainty whether their loved ones died naturally or were murdered by the nurse responsible for their care. The psychological profile compiled by forensic psychiatrists describes Cullen as suffering from severe depression, personality disorders, and a pathological need for control manifested through power over life and death. His repeated suicide attempts and his projection of death wishes onto others created a twisted psychology where ending lives temporarily relieved his own suicidal ideation. Each murder was essentially a displaced suicide, with victims serving as surrogates for his own desired non-existence. What makes Charles Cullen's case uniquely disturbing is not just the body count or the duration of his killing spree, but the systematic failure of institutions meant to protect patients. He was not a mastermind who evaded detection through brilliance. He was sloppy, obvious, and repeatedly suspected. Yet the system failed at every level to stop him, choosing institutional self-preservation over human life. His victims were sacrificed not just by a killer, but by the cowardice of administrators who looked away from uncomfortable truths. The Angel of Death's 16-year reign of hospital terror stands as a chilling reminder that evil can hide behind the most trusted facades, and that the greatest enabler of that evil is often not cunning, but cowardice. The unwillingness of those in power to confront uncomfortable realities and take the difficult actions necessary to protect the vulnerable from those who would do them harm. Thank you for watching and being part of this dive into the dark and fascinating stories that keep us all on edge. If you enjoyed the ride, remember to like, subscribe, and share with others who crave a good mystery. Tell us where you're watching from. I love knowing where in the world our true crime family is tuning in. Your presence means a lot. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and keep digging into the shadows where truth and mystery meet.